A handful of dry oats turned 1 pound of ground beef into enough for the whole table, and nobody at dinner ever knew. That is one of 100 cooking tricks your grandmother kept in her head and never wrote down. She knew how to fix an oversalted soup with a raw potato. She knew how to bring stale bread back to life with nothing but a damp towel and a warm oven. One trick in this video turns a single chicken into 5 completely different meals. Another saves burned gravy in under 30 seconds using cold water and a clean pot. These are not recipes. These are the shortcuts figured out by women who stood at that stove every single day until the method was automatic. Here are 100 genius grandma cooking tricks you will wish you knew sooner. How to avoid lumpy gravy was one of those everyday lifesavers taught early in home economics class. Students were shown how to whisk flour into fat first, creating a smooth paste before adding liquid. This simple step, called making a roux, prevented clumps from forming and gave gravy a silky texture. Teachers emphasized steady stirring, never letting the mixture sit still long enough to scorch. Broth, milk, or pan drippings were added slowly, transforming into sauce right before their eyes. Many remembered the excitement of watching a watery mixture thicken perfectly. Gravy was important because it turned plain potatoes or meat into something satisfying. Families relied on it as a way to stretch flavor across the whole plate. Avoiding lumps may have seemed small, but it was proof that skill mattered more than luck in the kitchen. For many, this trick became one they used for the rest of their lives. Gelatin fruit. Molds with canned juice turned ordinary pantry items into a dessert that looked like it belonged at a holiday banquet. Grandma saved the syrup from canned peaches, pears, or pineapples and used it to flavor homemade gelatin made from unflavored packets and a little sugar. Chilled in bright molds and dotted with slices of fruit, the finished dish sparkled like stained glass on the table. Children loved the wiggly texture and sweet bursts of fruit, while adults admired how such an inexpensive treat could feel so festive. This dessert required no rare ingredients, yet impressed guests as much as any bakery confection. It was a small luxury born from thrift and creativity, showing that celebration did not depend on wealth but on imagination. Each shimmering slice reminded the family that joy could be coaxed from even the simplest shelf-stable supplies when someone cared enough to try. Wax paper pie crust rolling was a small, neat miracle in every baker's routine. The trick was simple. Place dough between 2 sheets of wax paper, then roll it flat without ever touching the counter. No flour clouds, no sticking, no cleaning up bits of dough from every corner. It made rolling faster and neater and helped keep the crust light. Housewives found that pie dough came out more even, less dry, and easy to lift into the pan without tearing. Wax paper acted like a gentle buffer, holding everything in place and making cleanup a breeze. In a kitchen where mess meant more work and time was precious, this trick was a quiet revolution. You did not need a fancy mat or special tools, just a roll of wax paper from the drawer and a steady hand. Even the rolling pin stayed clean, and once the pie was in the oven, you tossed the paper with no fuss. It was neat, clever, and all about working smarter. Tricks like this helped make dessert feel possible even on the busiest, tightest days, and that meant everything. Powdered milk foam for dessert topping was a moment of real creativity hiding in the back of the pantry. When fresh cream or eggs were out of reach, powdered milk stepped in, and with the right touch, it fluffed into something that passed for whipped topping. You mixed the powder with cold water, chilled it down as much as possible, and beat it with sugar until it grew light and airy. Sometimes people added a splash of lemon juice or vanilla to round out the flavor. It was not quite whipped cream, but it was good enough to top a pudding, finish a Jell-O mold, or crown a square of sponge cake. And it made desserts feel finished, even if the ingredients were missing in action. Kids did not question it. They just remembered the sweet, creamy taste. It was affordable, shelf-stable, and dependable. That was the magic of it. Nobody uses powdered milk like this today, but it once stood in proudly when nothing else could. Plain boiled wheat berries were a dish that reminded people just how far they had come and how far they still had to go. Wheat berries are whole, unprocessed kernels of wheat that take a long time to cook and an even longer time to chew. But during the Depression, they were affordable, full of fiber, and could be bought in bulk. Families would boil them for hours, softening them just enough to be spooned into bowls like porridge. Sometimes a bit of salt or molasses was added, but most of the time it was just grain and water. The texture was dense, almost nutty, and the feeling of fullness lasted longer than most other meals. It was common on farms and in rural communities where wheat was grown or traded directly. The simplicity of it made it reliable, and when paired with a piece of bread or a spoonful of jam, it could pass as breakfast or dinner. Some families toasted leftover wheat berries to reuse in stews or baked them into loaves. No part of the grain was wasted, and no meal was taken for granted. This was not food for pleasure. It was food for survival. Using pumpkin shells as nature's crockpots was one of the most visually stunning and practical techniques Native American cooks ever invented. Imagine carving out a big, sturdy pumpkin, filling it with a mixture of meats, roots, grains, and herbs, and setting it carefully near a low, steady fire. The thick pumpkin walls would slowly roast from the outside while the food inside simmered gently, absorbing all the sweet, nutty flavors of the squash itself. The pumpkin became pot, oven, and seasoning all in one, with no waste and no need for heavy metal tools. When the meal was ready, you simply cut into the tender pumpkin itself and ate it alongside the hearty stew it had helped create. It was a way of turning even the simplest gathering into a feast. And if you thought cooking in pumpkins was impressive, just wait until you see how native cooks used nothing but green leaves and open steam to create fish dishes that tasted like a gift straight from the earth itself. Crisping cracklings for cornbread was a favorite move in kitchens where nothing was wasted. When pork was rendered for fat, the crunchy bits left behind were saved as cracklings. Grandfathers stirred these into cornbread batter before baking, adding texture, flavor, and protein. The result was a golden pan of cornbread with crisp surprises in every bite. It was filling, nutritious, and kept families satisfied when meat was scarce. Crackling cornbread became more than food. It was a memory of gatherings around the table, where every slice carried the taste of thrift and ingenuity. This simple addition turned a humble bread into a complete meal. Served with beans or greens, it could keep a family full for hours. The practice showed how every part of an animal was valued, down to the last crunchy morsel. Today, the idea seems unusual, but back then, cracklings in cornbread were a sign of clever cooking and smart living. Potato donuts might sound strange today, but in thrifty kitchens of the past, they were a clever way to stretch ingredients and make a treat feel more filling. Leftover mashed potatoes or grated boiled potatoes were mixed right into the dough, giving the donuts a soft, moist texture that regular flour alone could not match. A splash of milk, a spoonful of sugar, and a dash of nutmeg or cinnamon turned the plain mixture into something that felt special. Once fried, the outside crisped up golden, while the inside stayed tender and just slightly chewy. Sometimes they were dusted with powdered sugar or rolled in cinnamon sugar, and sometimes they were enjoyed plain with a hot cup of coffee. Families swore by them as a way to avoid waste, and children loved the novelty of a donut that tasted a little different. Potato donuts proved resourcefulness could turn scraps into a sweet indulgence. Gelatin whipped desserts were one of those clever inventions that transformed pantry staples into something that seemed elegant, almost restaurant-worthy, even when times were tough. Housewives chilled evaporated milk, whipped it until light and fluffy, and folded it into flavored gelatin, producing a mousse-like dessert that looked fancy without costing much. The whips came in bright colors, carried a playful texture, and felt indulgent enough to appear at birthdays, Sunday dinners, and church suppers across small towns. Children were delighted by the wobble and airy feel, while parents smiled at the practicality of creating something festive out of ingredients already sitting in the cupboard. The recipe was smart because it stretched one small box of gelatin into a dessert that could serve a large family, and sometimes even more. The creamy look also masked the fact that it contained no cream, only canned milk and powdered gelatin. Food companies advertised the gelatin, but never highlighted how little it took to feed a crowd when made this way. In reality, The trick was thrift wrapped in a smile, turning frugality into celebration. Gelatin whipped desserts proved that ingenuity and joy could exist together on the table. Creamed, canned corn with a flour slurry was one of those dishes that made something ordinary feel just a little indulgent. The idea was to take a can of corn, cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, and give it a makeover. You'd pour the corn, liquid and all, into a saucepan and stir in a quick mix of water and flour. As it simmered, the slurry thickened the liquid into a creamy, starchy sauce that hugged every kernel. Some recipes suggested a splash of milk or a dab of margarine if you had it. But even without those, the final result was comforting. It mimicked the texture of creamed corn without needing fresh cream or butter, two things that were either rationed or too expensive for many homes. This little side dish showed up at dinner tables next to meatloaf, fried potatoes, or bean patties, giving the meal a creamy contrast and helping to fill plates without much cost. It's a great example of how far a single can and a spoonful of flour could go. Cookbooks promoted this trick for its thrift, but people remembered it because it worked. Simple, smart, and warm. What more could you ask for? Rolled crust pie toppers were the sweet finish made from scraps. In a time when nothing could go to waste, not even leftover pastry, cooks got creative. The ends of pie dough were rolled thin, brushed with a little water or drippings, sprinkled with sugar or cinnamon, and baked until crisp. That was your treat. It did not take much. A warm oven, a spare minute, and a bit of imagination. These little crisps were handed out to children like cookies or set on the table with tea as a quiet dessert. Some people curled them into spirals, others cut them into strips, but the goal was the same: stretch the dough, stretch the joy. You did not need filling or fruit, just flour, fat, and whatever flavor you could scrape together. And in that act of rolling and baking scraps, there was something quietly beautiful. It turned waste into something warm. It reminded folks that even the edges mattered, and it made a house smell like home, even if there was no pie underneath. Sometimes the crust was the best part, and during the Depression it was often the only part, so people made it count, every flaky bite. Saving overripe bananas for moist cakes was one of those quiet little traditions Grandma never needed to announce, but you could taste the results in every sweet, soft slice. You would walk into the kitchen, spot those brown spotted bananas sitting there, and probably assume they were destined for the trash. But not in Grandma's house. She saw those tired bananas as baking gold, packed with sweetness and ready to transform plain batter into something rich and moist. The riper the banana, the softer it blended into the cake, filling every crumb with natural sugar and keeping it tender for days. Banana bread, muffins, pound cakes, they all owed their irresistible texture to fruit most folks tossed without a second thought. Grandmas understood the kitchen was not just about following recipes. It was about stretching ingredients, wasting nothing, and turning overlooked scraps into something worth gathering around. You might not have known the secret behind that banana bread growing up, but your second helping told the story loud and clear. Baking bacon in the oven for less mess is one of those old cookbook tips that feels so obvious now, but back then it was a game changer for busy kitchens. Frying bacon on the stovetop leaves grease everywhere, countertops, walls, and your clothes. But home cooks figured out a better way. Lay the bacon flat on a baking sheet, pop it in the oven, and let it cook until crisp. No flipping, no splatter, and every slice cooks evenly. It was a lifesaver for Sunday breakfasts or feeding a crowd. You would find this trick tucked in community cookbooks, especially during the 50s and 60s when families cooked big, hearty meals on tight schedules. Honestly, I struggled with uneven, greasy bacon for years before learning this. A simple baking sheet, an oven, and one forgotten old cookbook trick, it changed breakfast forever. You did not need fancy tools to bake in the 70s. No pastry cutter? Grab a fork. Cutting butter into flour was key for pie crusts, biscuits, and dumplings. A fork worked fine if you pressed with the tines and used the edges like blades. It took longer and hurt your wrist, but it worked. Flaky layers, cold butter, and dough that came together just right. It was not about speed. It was about precision. People knew what texture to look for and when to stop. The fork was enough. Some used 2 knives, others stuck with a fork and steady hands. The idea was to keep butter cold and flour dry until the last second. And when it came together, the results were magic. The crust cracked, the biscuits rose, and no one asked what tool you used. They just asked for seconds. That was the real test. How to stretch milk with powdered milk was a lesson in thrift that many households quietly appreciated. Teachers instructed students to mix powdered milk with fresh, creating more without losing flavor. This stretched supplies during tight times when buying more milk was not possible. For children who drank glasses daily, it meant nothing changed on the table. In cooking, it gave sauces and puddings the same creaminess without extra cost. Students discovered that careful blending made the difference, since lumpy powdered milk gave the trick away. Once mastered, it became nearly impossible to notice. Families valued the savings, while students gained respect for how creativity solved problems in the kitchen. It was not just about milk. It was about making more out of less. This simple trick carried the spirit of home economics, where thrift and skill came together. It was a reminder that even shortages could be overcome with clever thinking. Rice filler meatballs were the answer when a single pound of meat had to feed a big table without leaving anyone hungry. Grandma mixed cooked rice into seasoned ground beef, forming tender meatballs that held their shape in a bubbling tomato sauce. The rice absorbed the flavors and released gentle starch that made the sauce silky and thick, while adding volume to every bite. Served over noodles or tucked into crusty bread, these meatballs seemed endless and tasted rich enough to rival expensive versions. Children enjoyed the surprise of soft grains inside, while adults admired how a modest pantry staple transformed a small amount of meat into a feast. The dish became a weeknight favorite because it balanced frugality with comfort and never felt like a compromise. Each bite carried the quiet satisfaction of stretching food wisely and the proud memory of a cook who could make plenty from almost nothing at all. Stretching ground beef with rolled oats was not just frugal, it was necessary. Meat was pricey and often rationed, but families still needed protein on the plate. Instead of using a full pound of beef for meatloaf or burgers, housewives would mix in rolled oats. They soaked up flavor, added texture, and held the mixture together like a charm. You would never guess there was less meat. And if you seasoned it well, with onion, garlic, or even ketchup, it tasted like the full thing. Some even preferred it that way. It was healthier, heartier, and cheaper. This trick helped feed more mouths without sacrificing quality. You could get 6 burgers out of a half pound of beef if you did it right. Housewives took pride in that. It was not about cutting corners. It was about making smart use of what you had. And in a time when every meal was cooked from scratch, that kind of ingenuity was respected. It made dinner stretch further, and everyone left the table full. Today we might call it a budget recipe. Back then, it was just how things were done, quietly clever and always thoughtful. Evaporated milk whipped cream was the sort of dessert trick passed between neighbors, not down through cookbooks. When cream was too expensive or just plain missing from the fridge, you reached for that dented can of evaporated milk in the back of the cupboard. You chilled it until it was ice cold, sometimes freezing it for 10 minutes, and then beat it with a whisk or mixer until it fluffed up. If you added a little sugar and a drop of vanilla, you almost could not tell the difference. It would not hold shape as long as the real thing, but it made a bowl of canned peaches or gelatin salad feel like a special treat. Children did not care if it came from a cow or a can. If it looked creamy, that was enough. You could even fold it into puddings or layer it in trifles. The trick was to keep everything cold and to know when to stop mixing. Today's cookbooks skip this entirely. They assume everyone has heavy cream or will just buy whipped topping. But the old way worked just fine, and it felt like magic every time it turned out right. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side, a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Bread crust pie lattice was the ultimate make-do solution for bakers who hated to waste a single scrap. Instead of tossing out the crusts from sliced sandwich bread, especially the heels, home cooks braided or layered them across the top of a pie. You would soak the crusts briefly in a little milk or brush them with melted butter to soften them up, then shape them into rustic strips. They would toast up golden in the oven and give the pie a rough, homemade charm that you just could not fake. It was not flaky like traditional crust, but it held its shape and added a chewy, buttery layer to each slice. This trick showed up in Depression era and wartime cookbooks as a way to conserve flour, since making a second crust from scratch was not always an option. It worked best on fruit pies or pudding pies that needed a topping but did not require full coverage. You would be surprised how many old-timers still remember this with a kind of fondness. Those scrappy little pies made with crusts no one wanted. And the best part? It actually tasted pretty good. How native chefs made instant trail mix with dried berries and nuts is a perfect example of simple genius meeting real-world survival. Long before colorful packages lined grocery store shelves, Native American communities were gathering handfuls of nature's purest energy foods, drying them carefully under the sun, and combining them into powerful portable meals. Wild berries like chokecherry, elderberry, and wild strawberries were prized for their tartness and nutrition, while nuts like acorns, walnuts, and pine nuts packed a heavy punch of fat and protein. Some tribes even added roasted seeds, puffed grains, or strips of dried meat for extra stamina. The goal was not just taste, but endurance. It was survival in your pocket, designed by thousands of years of knowledge. And while they packed sweetness and strength into every bite, when it came to seasoning savory meals, native chefs turned to another source altogether: wild plants that turned every piece of meat into pure wilderness flavor. Boiling cloth bags of pudding was one of those homely tricks that saved energy and made dessert possible. Instead of baking in the oven, your grandfather's family would fill a cloth bag with a sweet batter of flour, sugar, dried fruit, and spices, then tie it shut. The bag was dropped into simmering water and left to cook slowly. Hours later, the pudding was removed, firm and fragrant, sliced and served like cake. It required no oven fuel, no special pans, and only the most basic ingredients. Families cherished these puddings at holidays because they felt festive without needing luxuries. The cloth bag could be washed and reused, keeping the tradition going for years. Each slice was proof that desserts could be made from scraps and patience. It was not fancy, but it filled plates and brought smiles when sweetness was hard to come by. Clever, thrifty, and warming, it was dessert born from hardship that still felt like a treat. In the back of every freezer was a mystery bag. It was not filled with leftovers or frozen meals. It was filled with scraps. Onion ends, carrot peels, celery tops, chicken bones, and parsley stems all went into that one sacred bag. When it was full, it was soup night. You dumped the whole thing into a pot with water, added salt and pepper, and let it simmer into stock. Some families added a bay leaf. Others let the vegetables and bones speak for themselves. The broth was never the same twice, but it was always warm and rich. It became chicken noodle, barley, or rice soup, whatever you had. Nothing store-bought ever tasted as real, and it cost nothing. This was dinner made from what others tossed. It was the 70s way of making food stretch, not by cutting corners, but by using everything. Parents taught kids to save peelings not because it was charming, but because that was how food lasted. That was how you respected your groceries. The soup bag might not look like much, but it was gold. Turning leftover mashed potatoes into quick potato cakes is the kind of kitchen trick you find buried in old recipe cards, the forgotten wisdom that saved breakfast more times than we will ever know. Leftover mashed potatoes are tricky. Let them sit in the fridge too long, and they turn into sad, gluey lumps no one wants. But home cooks back in the day knew better. They would grab that cold mash, form little patties, and fry them up in a skillet until golden and crispy on the outside, soft in the middle. Suddenly, those leftovers became a whole new meal, hot, comforting, and filling. It was a common breakfast in farm towns and city kitchens alike, showing up at the table with eggs, bacon, or just on their own. You will not see it much on brunch menus today, but honestly, I wish I had learned this sooner. So many leftovers wasted when they could have turned into crispy, golden potato cakes with just one old cookbook trick. Turning potato water into soup base was one of those humble, brilliant moves Grandma pulled off without ever calling attention to it. After boiling potatoes for dinner, most folks drained that cloudy, starchy water straight into the sink, but Grandma never wasted a thing, especially not something so useful. That leftover water, rich with starch and nutrients, became the foundation for hearty soups, creamy gravies, and even stews that tasted like they simmered for hours. It added body, a little thickness, and a subtle, earthy flavor that brought everything together without needing expensive stock or extra ingredients. Grandma's new meals had to stretch, groceries had to last, and waste was never an option. You would sip that soup, warm, rich, and filling, and never guess it started with something most people tossed away. It was resourceful, practical cooking, quiet genius passed down through generations, born from hard times but still making meals better today. Mock whipped cream from evaporated milk was a tiny miracle that made dessert possible when dairy was scarce. You would chill a can of evaporated milk until it was icy cold, then beat it with sugar and a splash of vanilla until it fluffed up into soft peaks. It did not hold quite like real cream, but it got close enough for cake toppings, fruit bowls, or Jell-O salads. The texture was light but sturdy, and the taste had that rich, slightly caramelized edge evaporated milk is known for. It was not perfect, but it was magic in a pinch. Housewives swore by it for special occasions or Sunday suppers when a bit of sweetness was needed. Some even froze the whipped mixture for a pseudo ice cream. The trick was making the most of shelf-stable goods and transforming what seemed flat into something joyful. No one expected miracles during the Depression, but this came close. It made humble ingredients feel celebratory. And in homes where cream was just a dream, this trick kept dessert on the table and smiles in the room. Sour milk baking substitutes were a reliable trick from the old kitchen playbook. When milk spoiled, and it often did without refrigeration, homemakers didn't panic. They baked with it. The acidity of sour milk, paired with a bit of baking soda, gave baked goods a fluffy rise and a rich flavor that mimicked buttermilk. Cookbooks from the 1930s and 40s treated sour milk like an essential, with entire sections dedicated to how to use it in cakes, biscuits, or pancakes. Some cooks even soured fresh milk intentionally with lemon juice or vinegar just to keep recipes consistent. And it wasn't just about avoiding waste. It was also about making delicious, fluffy food out of things that would have otherwise been tossed. Housewives during wartime learned to see every ingredient as usable, and sour milk was no different. Even today, some bakers still insist that sour milk makes better cornbread than anything else. It was one of those tricks that stuck because it worked, and because it proved that even spoiled food could still feed a family. A boiled dinner was one of the heartiest frugal meals poor families relied on, born from the idea that you could simmer almost anything together and create a dish filling enough to last for days. The base usually included bits of inexpensive meat or even bones that were boiled slowly with potatoes, cabbage, and turnips. The long cooking time softened the vegetables and drew every bit of flavor out of the meat scraps, creating a broth that felt rich even if little protein was used. Nothing was wasted, and leftovers were often saved and reheated for the next day, with new vegetables added to stretch it further. This kind of dish was common in rural households and immigrant communities where thrift was already a way of life. It brought warmth in the winter and offered the satisfaction of a stew without the cost of a heavy roast or expensive cuts. Families valued boiled dinners not only for nourishment, but also because they fed large households with minimal effort. It was the kind of meal that could be adjusted endlessly depending on what was available, and it gave poor families the assurance that no one would leave the table hungry, no matter how little was in the pantry. Cereal box recipes for marshmallow squares might have been advertised to sell the cereal, but resourceful moms quickly figured out endless spin-offs. The classic crispy rice treat was just the start, with marshmallows melted into butter and mixed with cereal before being pressed into pans. Mothers experimented with other cereals, from cornflakes to wheat puffs, making variations that were cheaper and often tastier than the boxed desserts. The trick was using whatever was on hand, proving that recipes were guides, not rules. This cleverness saved money while still giving children the fun snacks they craved, without relying on the company's packaged versions. It showed how families took corporate marketing and turned it into something of their own, stretching products further and reclaiming control over what they ate. Casseroles with crushed potato chips on top might sound indulgent, but they were really a thrifty invention of clever 1960s moms. Instead of throwing away the crumbs at the bottom of a snack bag, they sprinkled them over casseroles as a crunchy topping. The chips added flavor, texture, and a golden crust that made even the simplest casserole feel exciting. Popular with tuna, chicken, or vegetable bases, the crunchy topping transformed leftovers and pantry staples into something families looked forward to. It was also a way of stretching expensive ingredients by making casseroles the star of the meal rather than a side dish. The trick appealed to kids who loved the fun of finding chips baked into dinner and reassured parents who wanted nothing to go to waste. The casserole itself became a canvas for creativity, but it was the potato chip topping that made it memorable. Moms of the 1960s proved that even the last crumbs from a snack bag could turn a basic family meal into comfort food with a touch of flair. Cracker Barrel cheese logs were the retro answer to snacking boards long before charcuterie became fashionable. Housewives would mix cheese with spices or herbs, roll it into logs, and coat it in paprika or sesame seeds for flair. Served with crackers, it became the highlight of parties and church gatherings, giving everyone something to nibble on without emptying the wallet. The appeal lay in its simplicity. It looked indulgent, but took little time or money to prepare. Rolling the cheese into a tidy log made it easy to slice, keeping everything neat and manageable on a tray. It was versatile, too, since nearly any combination of cheese and coating worked, making it a flexible solution when supplies varied. These cheese logs turned the ordinary into the memorable, showing off creativity in a way that seemed effortless. They were clever centerpieces that turned everyday pantry items into a conversation piece. Cornflake-topped casseroles were the crunchy secret to making church suppers feel just a little more exciting. Instead of breadcrumbs, which were not always available or affordable, women crushed cornflakes and sprinkled them over the top of creamy dishes. The flakes baked into a golden crust that added texture and flavor. It was a clever way to use a cereal that was already in most kitchens, turning breakfast into a topping. At potlucks, casseroles with that golden crunch always stood out on the table, drawing hands before the plain versions. Whether it was potatoes, green beans, or noodles, cornflakes added that extra layer of satisfaction. The idea spread fast through church cookbooks, and soon nearly every family had their own spin on it. It made sense because it saved money, reduced waste, and delivered results people loved. The topping was also fun for children to help make, crushing the cereal into crumbs before baking. Over time, cornflake casseroles became a defining dish of community meals, carrying with them the spirit of sharing. They were simple, affordable, and unforgettable, just like the gatherings where they were served. Turning rendered fat into soap showed just how little was wasted in those earlier kitchens. After roasting or frying meat, the leftover fat was collected and stored until enough was gathered for soap making. Mixed with lye and water, it hardened into bars that cleaned as effectively as anything from a store. Grandfathers remembered a time when buying soap was a luxury, and this homemade version kept households supplied. The process was smelly and messy, but the end result was useful and reliable. Every bit of animal, from fat to bone, was valued for what it could provide. This trick tied together cooking and cleaning in a cycle of practicality. Even when money was tight, families could stay stocked with something essential. It was a reminder that nothing had to go to waste, not even grease. Soap made from kitchen fat was not glamorous, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. Spicing meat with wild juniper and sage instead of store-bought seasonings was a mark of true culinary craftsmanship long before organic became a buzzword. Juniper berries with their sharp piney taste and sage leaves with their deep, smoky aroma were easy to find across wide swaths of native lands, and together they created one of the oldest and most unforgettable flavor combinations known to man. Hunters would rub juniper directly onto fresh meat before roasting it over fires, allowing the resins to seep into the flesh and protect it from bacteria while infusing it with mouth-watering flavor. Sage was burned, brewed, and crushed into spice blends that transformed even the toughest game meats into savory, aromatic feasts. And just when you think seasoning meat could not get any more poetic, native chefs took it one step further, discovering a way to use wild berries not just as food, but as a way to glaze and preserve fish in the most mouth-watering way imaginable. Peanut butter and meatloaf might sound like a dare, but in the mid-century kitchen, it was just another thrifty trick. Ground beef was expensive, especially when you were trying to feed more mouths than you had meat. So home cooks started mixing in all sorts of things to bulk it up: breadcrumbs, oats, mashed beans, and yes, peanut butter. A few spoonfuls of peanut butter made the mixture stickier and easier to mold, added a little fat for moisture, and brought a nutty depth that some people genuinely came to love. The flavor was subtle, not overpowering, and often paired with ketchup or tomato sauce on top to balance it out. You would find this idea popping up in wartime rationing cookbooks and community recipe swaps, usually in the margins with little notes like "kids did not notice" or "husband approved." It was especially popular in places where peanuts were cheap and beef was not. These meatloaves were humble, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful, and when baked right, they held together beautifully. The next time you are low on ingredients and high on curiosity, try it. You might understand why people kept doing it even after the war ended. Refrigerator pickling with vinegar and sugar was how housewives brought a little brightness into their meals without a full day of canning. You sliced cucumbers, onions, or even green beans, poured over a hot mix of vinegar, sugar, and spices, then sealed the jar and let it chill. No boiling water baths, no pressure cookers, just patience and a fridge shelf. In a day or two, you had sweet, tangy pickles that added snap and flavor to otherwise plain meals. They stayed crisp, looked colorful, and made sandwiches or roasts feel like something special. Best of all, it gave you control. You adjusted the sweetness, spiced it your way, and worked with whatever was in season. Refrigerator pickling felt homemade, but also modern. It was fast enough for weeknight dinners, but classic enough to impress guests. This trick helped housewives stay ahead, turning garden extras or produce drawer stragglers into little jars of joy. In a world where nothing was wasted, pickling meant preservation, not just taste. And every time you opened the fridge to that tangy scent, it felt like a little reward for doing things the smart way. How to clarify soup broth was one of those seemingly small lessons that showed students the difference between plain cooking and refined cooking. Teachers explained that skimming foam during simmering and straining through cloth or fine sieves kept broth clear, golden, and appetizing. It was not about changing flavor, but about presentation and pride. A clear broth looked cleaner, more professional, and carried a sense of care. Students learned patience, hovering near pots and skimming off impurities with spoons, a practice that required focus. Some teachers even demonstrated the egg white trick, where beaten whites were stirred in to attract particles before straining. Families appreciated broths that looked as beautiful as they tasted, especially during holidays or when guests were expected. Clear soups were once a mark of skill, and students who learned the process felt they had taken a step closer to real cooking mastery. It was a reminder that home economics was not just about feeding a family, but about doing so with thoughtfulness and care. A bowl of clarified broth became a symbol of effort done right. Stuffed bell peppers with rice gave Grandma a colorful way to stretch a handful of meat into a full family dinner without anyone noticing the thrift behind it. She halved bright green or red peppers, scooped out the seeds, and filled them with a seasoned mixture of cooked rice, diced vegetables, and just a small amount of ground beef or sausage. The rice absorbed tomato sauce and spices, making every bite satisfying while keeping costs low. Baked slowly until the peppers softened and the filling melded together, the dish emerged fragrant and hearty. Children loved the tender sweetness of the roasted pepper, while adults appreciated how a single skillet of filling could feed a crowd. It was a clever use of garden produce and pantry staples that turned what could have been a meager meal into something special enough for Sunday. Each pepper stood like a little edible bowl of abundance, proving that a careful cook could turn scarcity into celebration night after night. Reusing cereal bag liners as wax paper was a kitchen trick hiding in plain sight. Once the kids had torn through their cornflakes or puffed rice, housewives would carefully remove the inner plastic liner, shake out the crumbs, and set it aside. This waxy, crinkly paper was not trash. It was an all-purpose kitchen tool. You could wrap sandwiches in it, cover leftovers, line cake pans, or even roll out pie dough without sticking. It was durable, clean, and, best of all, completely free. In the 1950s, every penny saved counted, and this clever reuse was like a quiet rebellion against waste. Homemakers found dozens of ways to repurpose what others might throw out. It was a lesson in resourcefulness, not just frugality. If you grew up during that time, you probably remember the sound of those liners being folded and tucked away in a drawer. That crinkle was the sound of a house being run right. Modern kitchens may have parchment and plastic wraps galore, but nothing beats the feeling of giving something a second life. In a way, cereal bags were just another example of how every part of the home was expected to pull its weight, even the packaging. Bread-soaked meatballs were a small act of genius hiding in plain sight. When you did not have enough breadcrumbs, or when the bread itself was too stale to eat, you soaked it in milk until it turned soft and fluffy. Then you mixed it into ground meat, herbs, and maybe an egg if you had one. The result? A tender, juicy meatball that held its shape without drying out. This trick also stretched your meat further, letting 1 pound do the work of 2. It came from Italian kitchens, but American homes embraced it fast. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and penny-pinching mothers all used it. And it was not just for meatballs. You would see the same method in meatloaf and stuffed peppers too. The soaked bread kept things moist without adding weight. Modern recipes may call for panko or fancy crumbs, but this old trick still beats them all when it comes to comfort and thrift. Homemade noodles made from just flour and water were a Depression staple that turned bare cupboards into something hearty. No eggs, no fancy tools, just a rolling pin, a knife, and some determination. Families would mix flour with water until it formed a stiff dough, then roll it thin and cut it into strips or shapes. The noodles were left to dry or boiled right away and dropped into soups, stews, or even just salted water. They soaked up flavor like a sponge, which was perfect when you had more broth than solids. Making noodles became a family affair, with children helping to roll and cut on floured tables. Sometimes people hung them over chairs or laid them out on dish towels to dry. It was messy work, but it filled time and bellies alike. When store-bought pasta was out of the question, these homemade versions stepped in proudly. They had chew, they had bite, and they gave even the thinnest broth some heft. It was food you made from almost nothing, and that always meant something. Celery salt on cottage cheese might not sound like much, but for mid-century dieters, it was a little miracle. In the 1950s, cottage cheese was hailed as the queen of health foods, low in fat, high in protein, and endlessly adaptable. But let us be honest, it was bland. Enter celery salt. Just a dash gave it a briny, herby kick that made the whole bowl come alive. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and sprinkled on everything from tomato slices to hard-boiled eggs. But with cottage cheese, it had a real glow-up. This combo became a go-to lunch for housewives watching their waistlines, often served on lettuce with half a pear or a canned peach on top. It looked like a diet plate but tasted like something more satisfying. You could find this suggestion in health columns, diet booklets, and women's magazines from coast to coast. It was a trick born of scarcity and self-restraint, dressed up to feel like something fancier. Even today, a bite of cottage cheese with a little celery salt feels like stepping into a lunch counter from 70 years ago. Quiet, cool, and just a little strange. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Using cold cellars instead of refrigerators was a practice rooted in necessity. Grandfathers dug cellars into the earth or used existing basements to store food at a steady, cool temperature. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes were kept in bins of sand or sawdust to preserve them for months. Apples were stacked carefully, and cabbages hung from rafters to slow spoilage. The earth itself provided the refrigeration, keeping food edible long after harvest. This system meant families could rely on their crops through the winter without needing electricity. It also gave a sense of security, knowing that there was always something stored below ground. Visiting the cellar to gather ingredients was part of daily routine, a reminder of careful planning and foresight. Today, we take freezers for granted, but once it was a point of pride to keep a cellar stocked. Clever, reliable, and simple, it was one of the most effective survival tricks of the time. Leftover meatloaf sandwiches were nothing fancy, but they were a weekday miracle in 70s homes. Housewives knew that one meatloaf could stretch across several meals if handled wisely, and cold slices tucked between bread made school lunches go further. A slab of meatloaf with ketchup on white bread kept kids full, while thinner slices paired with mustard and onion became work lunches for husbands. It was not wasteful, it was resourceful, and everyone felt like they got something different, even though it was the same dish. Housewives often cooked meatloaf in bigger batches for exactly this reason, knowing that leftovers were not a burden but a solution. Sandwiches transformed last night's dinner into today's lunch, which was a small act of clever planning. Families saved money without ever feeling like they were missing out on fresh food. It was frugality disguised as convenience, which is why it stayed popular through the decade. The satisfaction of pulling a ready slice from the fridge and creating a meal in seconds was the reward for thinking ahead. Pimento cheese spread was one of those frugal recipes that showed how a few simple ingredients could turn into something memorable. Families mixed processed cheese with mayonnaise and chopped pimentos, creating a spread that was creamy, tangy, and bold enough to hold its own without costly meats. It was spread thick between slices of bread, packed into school lunches, or served on crackers at church gatherings. Housewives loved it because it stretched ingredients, turning one block of cheese and a jar of pimentos into days of filling sandwiches. Children thought it was fun because of the bright color, and adults appreciated how far it went when budgets were thin. Pimento cheese became a Southern staple but reached kitchens all across the country during lean decades. It carried pride with it because it proved flavor did not have to be expensive to be beloved. Even today, people who grew up with it remember its taste as comforting, tied to summer picnics, community suppers, and quick meals that felt indulgent even when money was tight. It was one of those tricks food companies wished families would forget because it kept people from needing pricier deli meats. Cabbage stretch soup was more than just a recipe. It was a lifeline in a pot. In times when meat was rare and vegetables limited, Cabbage became the star of the soup pot. Shredded thin and simmered with water, onion, and maybe a little broth if you were lucky. It created a warm, hearty base that could feed a family for pennies. Sometimes potatoes, carrots, or bits of pasta were added to bulk it up, but cabbage was always the anchor. It had the advantage of being cheap, easy to grow, and surprisingly filling. The best part? You didn't need much else. The longer it cooked, the sweeter and more tender it became, soaking up any seasoning you threw its way. Old cookbooks and wartime manuals often included cabbage soup under sustaining meals, or meatless mains, emphasizing its value for both health and economy. Some versions were inspired by European immigrants who had long relied on cabbage in their home cooking. It's not fancy, it doesn't pretend to be, but cabbage soup meant something back then. It meant warmth on cold nights, a meal that could stretch to feed everyone, and the quiet triumph of making something out of almost nothing. Southern kitchens had a quiet trick for making dried beans cook faster and come out creamier. Just add a teaspoon of baking soda. It sounded like science fiction at the time, but it worked like a charm. You soaked your beans overnight, yes, but the baking soda softened the outer skin and made the simmering go quicker the next day. Pinto beans, black-eyed peas, navy beans, all of them got the same treatment. The result? Tender beans that fell apart in your mouth, not on your spoon. It was a dinner base that showed up in everything from chili to red beans and rice. The trick also helped with digestion, though people did not always talk about that part. And since dried beans were one of the most affordable proteins on the shelf, anything that made them easier was worth remembering. Families planned their meals around them, and when meat was scarce or too expensive, beans stepped up. Add a slice of cornbread or a scoop of white rice and you had something that felt complete. It was not flashy, but it fed you right. And in the 70s, that was what good food meant. Floating egg test for freshness might sound like an old wives' tale now, but it was one of the smartest food safety tricks buried in vintage cookbooks. Before printed expiration dates were slapped on every carton, cooks needed a reliable way to check if their eggs were still good. You would fill a bowl with water and gently place the egg inside. If it sank to the bottom and lay flat, it was fresh. If it floated upright or worse, bobbed to the surface, it was time to toss it. This trick showed up in old kitchen guides and recipe booklets from the 40s to the 70s, especially when eggs were scarce and wasting one was not an option. It was simple, practical, and saved countless meals from the horror of cracking open a rotten egg. Honestly, I cannot believe how long I went without knowing this one. One little bowl of water could have saved so many breakfast mishaps if someone had passed this down sooner. Fooling guests with mock apple pie using crackers sounds wild today, but for grandmas back in the Depression era, it was quiet, sweet genius. Apples were scarce, but dessert was not something you skipped, especially not when company was coming. So Grandma got clever. She crushed saltine crackers, softened them with sugar, cinnamon, and just the right touch of spice, layering them into a golden pie crust so good you would swear it was made from fresh apples. You would slice in, taste the warm filling, smell the butter and cinnamon, and never suspect the trick hiding in plain sight. Grandmas never bragged. They just served it up, smiled at the compliments, and quietly stretched ingredients when fruit was hard to find. That pie was more than dessert. It was proof that with a little kitchen know-how and a lot of heart, you could turn hard times into sweet memories, one slice at a time. Powdered milk reconstitution with mashed potato water was the kind of trick that only a truly desperate pantry could teach you. Powdered milk was a shelf-stable lifesaver, but when the supplies started running thin, families got smart about stretching every scoop. One of the best ways was to mix it not just with water, but with the starchy water left over from boiling potatoes. That murky liquid, usually poured down the drain, suddenly had a new job, adding thickness and body to the reconstituted milk. The result was creamier and more satisfying, especially in sauces, soups, or even as a drink if you chilled it well enough. Some people even used this mixture to cook rice or oatmeal, sneaking in a little more nutrition wherever they could. It was not glamorous, but it worked. And in kitchens where every ingredient counted, it was little tricks like this that made a big difference. You were not just saving money. You were getting more from what you had. squeezing every last bit of value from the food you worked so hard to find. That kind of knowledge was passed down like gold, quietly keeping families fed when options were few. Carrot mold salad was the kind of dish that defined its era. Made from lemon gelatin, shredded carrots, vinegar, and sometimes pineapple or celery, it created a jiggly, sweet-savory mold served cold. Wartime cookbooks often called it a refrigerator salad, easy to prepare ahead and stretch across several meals. Carrots were cheap, easy to grow, and full of vitamins, making them a favorite for Victory Garden cooks. Gelatin gave the dish its firm structure and allowed for clean slices. It became a familiar sight at picnics, church suppers, and potlucks, where something bright and affordable was always welcome. Some recipes added chopped peppers for crunch, but the core idea was simple: make vegetables feel festive. It may look odd today, but it represented optimism and invention during hard times. A shimmering slice of carrot mold might not be flashy, but it held pride and purpose in every bite. Making Jell-O salad hold its shape was a practical challenge in classrooms during the 1960s and 1970s, when molded salads filled tables at picnics and church suppers. Teachers explained that fruit had to be folded in only after the gelatin partially set. Otherwise, the pieces would sink or the mixture would collapse. Students stirred gently, careful not to break the wobble that was part of the charm. Cream or whipped topping could be added, but it had to be folded just so to stay fluffy. The whole process taught patience and timing, as well as a bit of presentation. Jell-O molds seemed simple, yet they were a test of planning and skill. Students who managed to unmold a perfect salad onto a plate felt like they had achieved something worth applause. At home, these salads became colorful highlights on tables filled with casseroles and meatloaf. It was a clever trick to make ordinary gelatin into a dish that drew attention. 3 bean-baked beans brought together whatever legumes lingered in the pantry and turned them into a main dish that felt both hearty and celebratory. Grandma mixed navy beans, kidney beans, and pinto beans with onions, molasses, and a hint of mustard, then baked them slowly until the sauce thickened and the beans soaked up every flavor. The aroma filled the house for hours, promising a dinner that needed no meat to feel complete. Served with cornbread or ladled over rice, it kept the family full on the coldest nights. This dish was easy to scale for potlucks or neighborhood gatherings, making it a favorite for church socials and community suppers. Each spoonful offered warmth, protein, and a touch of sweetness, proving that simple staples could satisfy even the biggest appetites. The recipe endured because it celebrated abundance without extravagance and turned everyday beans into something worthy of the center of the table. Using coffee grounds to deodorize the fridge was one of those tricks that seemed odd until it worked. Back before baking soda became the default fix, housewives would scoop yesterday's grounds into a bowl and place it quietly on a refrigerator shelf. The grounds soaked up odor without adding any strange smell of their own. It was quiet, reliable, and made use of something already on hand. Housewives loved finding second lives for everyday items, and this one was a winner. If your fridge started to smell like onions or last Sunday's roast, the grounds pulled the stink right out. And they did it naturally. No chemicals, no fuss. Plus, it made opening the door a little more pleasant, especially with company around. You might not think about it today, but back then, no one wanted their butter tasting like cabbage. This little trick helped keep flavors clean, meals fresh, and dignity intact. It was one more example of turning waste into usefulness and making the kitchen work smarter, not harder. And when you are running a household on a shoestring, that kind of wisdom matters more than anything. Salt rub for crispy chicken skin was the kind of trick that worked better than it had any right to. You rubbed coarse salt into the skin of a whole chicken, thighs, breasts, wings, everything. Then let it rest overnight in the icebox uncovered. The salt drew out moisture, tightened the skin, and left it primed to blister and crackle in the oven the next day. No need for basting or fancy glaze, just dry heat and a little patience. When it roasted, the skin puffed and crisped like potato chips, golden and full of flavor. Underneath, the meat stayed juicy. Some cooks even added a bit of ground pepper or paprika to the salt rub for a touch of color and spice. That contrast, crispy on the outside, tender inside, was what people remembered most. This dry brining method was passed from one cook to the next without much fuss because it just worked. Modern cookbooks talk about air chilling or convection fans, but back then it was salt and time, and it never failed to earn a seat at the Sunday dinner table. Corncob broth proved that even what looked like trash still had a job to do. After eating the corn kernels, usually boiled or cut from the cob, people would save the cobs and toss them into a pot of water. Add a few onion peels or garlic skins, and you had the beginnings of a mild, slightly sweet broth. It was not strong, but it had body. You could use it as a soup base, to cook rice or beans, or even sip it hot with a pinch of salt. Some families swore it helped stretch out meals when nothing else was left. In many kitchens, this broth was a weekly ritual in summer when corn was in season. The cobs would sit in the pot all day, simmering slowly until they gave up their last bits of flavor. It was depression logic at its finest. Do not waste what you cannot replace. Even stripped bare, the cobs still had something left to give. This broth turned scraps into sustenance, and sustenance into a survival tool. Mashed potato donuts were a wartime favorite that combined comfort, frugality, and just enough indulgence. They started as a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes, especially the cold, sticky kind no one wanted to reheat. Mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices, the dough was rolled out, cut into rings, and fried until golden. The potatoes made them tender on the inside, with a crisp outer shell that held up well to a dusting of powdered sugar or a quick dip in glaze. The texture was somewhere between a cake donut and a fritter, and they were surprisingly filling. These showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1940s and 1950s, usually listed under budget baking or no-waste desserts. They were popular at church events, bake sales, and family breakfasts, where everyone needed something sweet and satisfying. People even used boxed instant mashed potatoes when real ones were in short supply. It was not just about saving money, it was about turning scraps into something worth looking forward to. And in kitchens where not a spoonful could be wasted, these donuts made every bite count. Bologna salad spread was the definition of turning scraps into something special. Church ladies would grind bologna with pickles and mayonnaise, mixing it into a creamy, tangy spread that could be slathered onto white bread. It was cheap, quick, and filling, making it perfect for lunches and socials. What might have been dismissed as a lowly meat became the star of the table when served this way. The spread had a zesty kick that paired well with crackers too, making it a versatile dish for gatherings. Families appreciated it because it stretched a small amount of meat into sandwiches for a whole group. At church events, trays of bologna sandwiches wrapped in wax paper were often passed around, vanishing quickly. Children especially loved them, not knowing the spread was born from thrift. It became part of community cookbooks and was remembered fondly as a taste of simpler times. Bologna salad spread proved that resourcefulness and flavor could go hand in hand. It was not about luxury, but about making the most of what you had and sharing it generously. Pineapple cheddar casserole was one of those quirky pairings that defined the era. Housewives mixed sweet pineapple chunks with sharp cheddar cheese, baked it into a casserole, and served it alongside ham or pork at Sunday dinners. The sweet and savory combination surprised many, but it quickly became a favorite in community cookbooks. It was thrifty, since canned pineapple was affordable and cheddar stretched protein-heavy meals further. The dish struck a balance between novelty and tradition, standing out at gatherings while still being comforting. Families came to expect it during holidays, and housewives relied on its dependable ease. Its charm lay in the way it transformed two ordinary ingredients into something unforgettable, sparking conversations at dinner tables across the country. Frozen vegetable medleys and casseroles were a staple of 1960s kitchens as moms leaned on convenience without giving up the appearance of hearty, home-cooked meals. Bags of frozen peas, carrots, and green beans were affordable, stored easily, and required no peeling or chopping, which saved precious time. When stirred into casseroles, they added both volume and color, transforming even simple dishes into something that looked plentiful. This clever trick made it easy to feed larger families without relying solely on expensive fresh produce or meat. It was also a way of adding nutrition without much effort, something every busy mom appreciated. Frozen vegetable medleys quickly became a dependable pantry item, used not only in casseroles but also in soups and skillet meals. They reflected the shift toward modern convenience foods while still carrying the values of thrift and practicality. For many, the sight of bright green peas and orange carrots peeking out from a bubbling casserole is a nostalgic memory of comfort and home. Spam and pineapple skillet meals were a clever pairing that made canned meat feel like something tropical and even glamorous, despite being born from necessity. Housewives sliced spam into neat cubes, browned them in a skillet, and tossed them with canned pineapple chunks, onions, and peppers. Suddenly, the salty meat transformed into a bright, sweet, and savory supper that felt fresh out of Hawaii, even when made in small kitchens thousands of miles away. Children loved the sugary bite of pineapple, while parents appreciated how quickly the dish came together on hectic nights. It carried with it a feeling of festivity, a reminder that even rationed or cheap foods could be dressed up to feel celebratory. Food companies sold the spam, but it was housewives who stretched it, making it taste like more than emergency pantry meat. The combination became a favorite for church suppers, potlucks, and weeknight dinners, remembered with surprising fondness even years later. It was clever, resourceful, and joyful all at once. Spam and pineapple skillet meals proved that frugal food did not have to be boring, and that a little creativity could elevate the humblest can into a dish worth remembering. Cornbread and milk supper was a meal so humble it seems almost too simple to count, yet it filled countless bellies when money was scarce. The dish was nothing more than leftover cornbread crumbled into a bowl and covered with cold milk, sometimes sweetened slightly if sugar or molasses could be spared. It was eaten with a spoon, straight out of the bowl, and was considered a full supper by many families who had little else. For children, it often felt like a treat because it resembled cereal before boxed cereal was common, while for adults it was a reliable way to fill up at the end of the day. The beauty of the dish was its practicality. Cornbread was cheap to make, milk was nourishing, and together they created something greater than the sum of their parts. It was quick, easy, and required no additional cooking, which made it ideal for families tired after long days of work. Cornbread and milk supper reminded people that sometimes the simplest foods carried the greatest comfort, especially when hunger pressed close. It may have been born of hardship, but it became one of the most remembered frugal meals of its era. The rice and raisin breakfast bowl was one of those deeply humble meals that somehow managed to feel special. It was born from leftovers and pantry scraps, nothing more than cooked white rice, a handful of raisins, and a spoonful of sugar or syrup. Sometimes a little milk was poured on top, sometimes not. Yet it was a dish that stuck around for decades in American kitchens, especially during World War II and the Depression, when boxed cereals were a luxury and eggs were being rationed. This was the kind of breakfast that let families wake up to something warm and filling without spending anything new. It was also incredibly versatile. Cinnamon, nutmeg, or a drop of vanilla could turn it into something closer to a dessert. Some versions even added chopped apples or stewed prunes when fruit was available. But at its core, it was all about stretching rice into one more meal, one more bowl, one more morning where a full stomach meant a stronger day ahead. For kids especially, this sweet and simple bowl was often remembered not for what it lacked, but for how good it felt to start the day with it. Cornmeal mush slices were the breakfast that showed up twice. You would make a big pot of cornmeal mush, basically a thick porridge cooked with water and salt, and serve it hot for dinner or supper. But the real magic came the next morning. You would pour the leftovers into a pan, let them chill overnight, then slice them into thick rectangles and fry them in a little grease until crisp on the outside. What you got was something golden, crunchy, and soft in the middle, comfort food on a budget. Sometimes you would pour syrup or molasses over the top. Other times it went savory with a spoonful of beans or gravy. It was a blank slate, which made it a favorite in homes where ingredients were limited but routines were strong. You knew what you were getting. It was cheap, hearty, and filled the belly before a day of hard work. No one called it gourmet, but no one went hungry either. It taught families how to get 2 meals from one pot and how to turn yesterday's leftovers into today's ritual. That kind of thinking does not just save money. It builds resilience, one fried slice at a time. Coating fruit in gelatin for a longer-lasting salad was one of those old-fashioned tricks Grandma never bragged about, but every family picnic or church gathering proved it worked like a charm. You would walk past the food tables and see her fruit salad still looking bright, shiny, and perfect, even after hours in the sun. Grapes still plump, oranges still juicy, strawberries still holding their color, not a mushy mess in sight. The secret? A light coating of flavored gelatin stirred over the fruit, sealing in the moisture and keeping everything looking fresh. It was not about making the salad jiggly or strange. It was quiet protection that kept the fruit safe from heat and time. Grandmas understood presentation mattered, especially when food sat out at big gatherings, and they knew how to keep things looking their best with simple, practical tricks that never needed explaining. You just showed up, grabbed a scoop of that fruit salad, and wondered how hers always stayed picture perfect while everyone else's wilted. It was not magic. It was quiet know-how passed down through kitchens, picnics, and potlucks, one gelatin-coated grape at a time. Melting marshmallows for quick dessert frosting feels like something straight out of a child's birthday party, but it came from clever old-school cookbook tricks. Back when frosting ingredients like cream or butter were scarce or pricey, families found a shortcut hiding in the pantry: marshmallows. You would melt them down with a splash of milk and spread the gooey mix right over cakes or cupcakes. It cooled into a glossy, fluffy frosting that looked impressive without the time or cost of traditional icing. You would find this trick in community cookbooks and on the back of marshmallow packages from the 60s and 70s. It turned plain cakes into party showstoppers with almost no effort. Thinking back on all those rushed birthdays or last-minute bake sales, I cannot help but wish I had this shortcut sooner. One bag of marshmallows, one old cookbook, and dessert was saved. Before TikTok made it trendy, grandmas already knew the secret to fast biscuit dough: grate your butter. Cold, hard butter was hard to cut into flour, especially if you were short on time or tools. But if you used a box grater, those thin curls of butter spread evenly through the flour like little pockets of gold. As the biscuits baked, the butter melted just enough to puff up the dough, giving it flaky layers and soft insides. You did not need a pastry cutter. You just needed a little planning and a grater. Some cooks kept butter in the freezer just for this purpose. It worked for pie crusts, dumplings, and even scones. The texture was unbeatable. Biscuits came out tall and proud, with golden tops and steam rising the moment you cracked them open. Served with gravy, jam, or plain butter, they disappeared fast. It was a humble trick, but it made you feel like a pro. In kitchens where everything was done by hand and every shortcut mattered, this was one worth remembering. And no one needed a viral video to know it worked. Cooking vegetables without losing color was a trick that showed science in action. Green beans or broccoli were often used, and teachers explained that blanching in salted boiling water for just a few minutes kept vegetables bright instead of dull. Students were taught to shock them quickly in cold water afterward, locking in both color and crispness. It was a small step, but it turned something ordinary into something worth serving proudly. A plate of vivid green beans looked far more appetizing than limp gray ones. The lesson was that presentation mattered as much as flavor, and that nutrition could be preserved with a little care. It made students see vegetables differently, not as an afterthought, but as something beautiful on the plate. Families back home often saw a difference when those lessons carried over into dinner. Home economics turned vegetables into proof of skill, rather than just boiled side dishes. Homemade noodle dough saved trips to the store and delivered comforting bowls of pasta from nothing more than flour, egg, salt, and a little water. Grandma kneaded the dough until smooth rolled it thin across the floured table and sliced ribbons by hand with a steady rhythm that children loved to watch. The fresh noodles cooked in minutes and soaked up broth or sauce far better than the packaged kind. During cold winters, they often became the star of chicken soup, turning a modest pot into a meal that felt rich and generous. Making noodles at home cost pennies and turned a simple supper into a family event as everyone joined in to cut or hang strands to dry. The flavor and texture were unmatched, and the satisfaction of creating a staple from scratch gave each serving a special pride. It was a timeless skill passed down through generations, proving that with patience and a rolling pin, a kitchen could rival any shop. Folding leftovers into gelatin salads may raise eyebrows today, but in the 1950s, it was a practical and pretty way to make scraps feel special. Housewives would take bits of ham, chopped vegetables, or even shredded chicken and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. Poured into a mold and chilled, it transformed odds and ends into a centerpiece. These salads might look odd to modern eyes, but back then, they were admired for their color, their structure, and their thrift. You could use lemon gelatin for vegetables or tomato aspic for savory meats. It stretched small portions and added elegance to a plate, especially for luncheons or church potlucks. Kids might poke at them, but guests often smiled and served themselves a slice. It was creative, yes, but more than that, it was economical. When refrigeration was unreliable and meat was expensive, gelatin preserved and presented all at once. Housewives made the most of what was left and made it look like something fresh. Today, it seems like a trend frozen in time. But at the time, it was just smart homemaking with a little showmanship on the side. Mayonnaise cake moisture hack was a quiet baking miracle that nobody saw coming, until they tasted it. In lean times, when you didn't have fresh eggs, butter, or milk, you reached for a spoonful of mayonnaise. It sounds bizarre today, but back then, it was a stroke of culinary genius. Mayonnaise is, after all, just egg yolk, vinegar, and oil. Exactly the building blocks a cake needs to rise and stay moist. When mixed into a chocolate batter, it transformed the crumb into something soft, rich, and almost fudge-like. Even picky eaters didn't know the secret. You could serve it at birthdays, potlucks, or even Sunday suppers, and not a soul would guess what was inside. It worked with lemon cake, spice cake, even banana bread in a pinch. It didn't matter what brand you used, store-bought or homemade, it all added the right kind of richness. Long before vegan substitutions and plant-based baking went mainstream, people used what they had and made it work. Some families kept the recipe secret, others passed it down proudly. Either way, this strange little trick proved that resourcefulness could taste like celebration and that a spoonful of something unexpected could bring joy to the table. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Onion soup mix as meat marinade was one of the first true pantry hacks, and it came straight from a packet. Long before marinades came in bottled form, cooks reached for those little paper envelopes of instant onion soup mix and stirred them into everything. With just water and maybe a splash of oil, the mix became a tangy, deeply savory coating for chicken thighs, pot roast, or even pork chops. The salt, the dehydrated onion, the herbs, it was like magic in a bag. Suddenly, your dinner tasted slow-cooked without needing a spice rack. It became a staple in slow cookers, Sunday roasts, and midweek dinners that needed to feed six with not much to work with. The mix was cheap, available everywhere, and lasted practically forever in a drawer. Cookbooks and food ads praised it as flavor in minutes, and they were not wrong. Even now, some of the best meatloaf recipes still sneak in a packet. It was the kind of trick that made you look like a kitchen genius, even when all you did was open a box. Ash baking was one of the most brilliant and humbling ways Native American cooks created bread without any tools, fancy ovens, or even a proper surface. When you needed to eat, you did not wait for the perfect setup. You dug into the earth itself. Dough was shaped into rough rounds and placed directly onto a bed of hot ashes and embers, then gently covered with more hot ash. The bread would cook slowly, surrounded by a blanket of heat, becoming crusty on the outside and pillowy soft on the inside. If a little ash clung to it, so be it. You brushed it off and bit into a smoky, earthy flavor that modern kitchens would pay fortunes to recreate. It was cooking stripped down to its raw, purest form, food born right from fire and earth. Today, ash-baked bread might seem primitive, but taste one bite of it, and you will understand exactly why this method lasted for centuries. And if you thought bread from ash was wild, wait until you hear how native chefs used cactus to transform even the toughest, most stubborn pieces of meat into buttery, tender feasts. Using starch water for ironing was a thrifty household trick that showed nothing went to waste. After boiling potatoes or rice, the leftover water was saved instead of poured away. Grandfathers and grandmothers alike knew that this starchy liquid could be brushed, sprinkled, or sprayed onto clothes before ironing. It stiffened fabric, smoothed wrinkles, and gave shirts or linens a crisp finish that looked sharp without spending extra money. This was long before spray starch bottles lined grocery shelves, and it worked just as well. The trick was simple, effective, and completely free, making it part of weekly routines in households across America. Families appreciated the polish it brought, especially when appearances mattered at school, in church, or at the workplace. It was one of those quiet lessons in resourcefulness, showing children that clever thinking stretched what little a household had. A pot of boiled rice might feed the family, and its water could keep clothes presentable too. Clever tricks like this proved that nothing in the kitchen was ever truly wasted, and that every byproduct had another purpose. Before refrigerators were truly reliable in every home, people had tricks to keep milk from turning sour, and one of the simplest was a pinch of baking soda. Just a light sprinkle into the bottle helped neutralize acidity and slowed down the spoiling process. It was not a perfect fix, but it bought you an extra day or two, and sometimes that was all you needed. You could pour milk over cereal, stir it into coffee, or use it for baking without worrying about a sour edge. Housewives passed the tip down like folklore. Some swore by it, others used it only in a pinch, but everyone knew about it. You kept baking soda near the sink, near the fridge, and often near the milk. It worked in a quiet way. No fanfare, no flavor change, just one less thing to throw out. And when milk was expensive or hard to get, saving even half a bottle mattered. The 70s may have had better refrigeration than decades before, but old habits died hard, especially the ones that still worked. And this tiny kitchen science experiment kept a lot of breakfasts, recipes, and cups of coffee from going to waste. Salting eggplant to remove bitterness. Before frying is one of those small, forgotten prep steps that makes a huge difference, and it comes straight from vintage cookbooks. Eggplant can be tricky to cook. Slice it up and fry it straight away, and it often turns rubbery or leaves a bitter aftertaste. But home cooks back in the day knew the trick. You would slice the eggplant, sprinkle it generously with salt, and let it sit for about 30 minutes. The salt pulled out excess moisture and toned down the bitterness, making the eggplant tender, creamy, and perfect for frying or baking. It showed up in old Italian-American cookbooks, diner recipes, and handwritten cards tucked in recipe boxes. Honestly, I ruined so many meals trying to wing it with eggplant before learning this. If only someone had handed me this simple, time-tested trick sooner, I could have saved a lot of frying oil and my pride. Disguising tough meat with slow-simmered onion gravy was one of those quiet survival tricks your grandma pulled off when money got tight. Back then, not every cut of meat was tender, and sometimes you had to stretch the tough stuff to feed a family. That is where the onion gravy came in. Slowly simmered, full of rich, sweet flavor, it turned cheap, chewy meat into something soft, savory, and satisfying. You would sit down thinking it was a fancy dinner, but really, it was Grandma's quiet genius working with what she had. She probably never said much about it. Just stirred that pan, letting the onions caramelize, watching the gravy thicken, knowing dinner would turn out all right. Those meals stuck with you, not because they were fancy, but because they were clever, comforting, and filled with love disguised as good cooking. Mock ham loaf was not about fooling anyone. It was about bringing comfort when meat was a rare luxury. You would take mashed beans or lentils, stir in pork fat for richness, and add beet juice to give it that pink, ham-like color. The whole thing was shaped into a loaf, topped with a sweet glaze if you had sugar or molasses, and baked until firm around the edges. Some versions used breadcrumbs or oatmeal to bind it all together. Others included chopped onions or spices for flavor. It was salty, a little smoky, and just chewy enough to stand in for meat at the dinner table. Children would call it pink meat, even if it had no meat at all. And for families who had not seen a real ham in months, it filled a very real need. For familiarity, for warmth, and for something that felt like a meal. You sliced it thick, served it with canned vegetables or potatoes, and maybe had enough left for sandwiches the next day. It was humble food, made with care. Cabbage stretch stew turned a single pot into a feast by filling it with hearty leaves that softened into silky sweetness as they cooked. Grandma chopped cabbage into generous ribbons and simmered it with potatoes, onions, and just a little meat or smoked bone for flavor. The cabbage released moisture that thickened the broth and carried the seasoning through every bite, making the stew feel far richer than its cost. Served with a slice of homemade bread, it warmed the family through long winters and made even the scarcest pantry look abundant. The scent filled the house, drawing neighbors who often brought their own bowls, hoping for a taste. No one left hungry because the pot always seemed to hold enough for one more serving. This humble dish proved that a simple vegetable could turn a few scraps into a meal worth remembering, and reminded everyone that real comfort often begins with the simplest garden greens. Boiling bones for soup broth was an act of transformation, taking scraps and turning them into something nourishing and deeply flavorful. A leftover chicken carcass, beef knuckles, pork ribs, nothing went to waste. Housewives would toss the bones into a pot with onion ends, carrot tops, and peppercorns, then let it simmer low and slow. Hours later, they had a rich stock ready to be the base for a dozen different meals. No cartons, no cubes, just the honest flavor of what was left behind. It made soups heartier, gravies deeper, and even plain rice a little more special. Bones were not trash. They were the beginning of something. Housewives understood that a good broth meant tomorrow's dinner was halfway done. This was not just thrift, it was skill. Broth making was a quiet background job in the rhythm of home life. You did it while the laundry dried or while you wiped the table. It filled the house with comfort before anyone took a bite. Egg white paint for pie crust shine was the kind of kitchen trick passed down without words, just by watching someone do it. Before you had glossy photos in cookbooks or pre-made pastry shells, a good pie was known by its crust. And nothing made that crust sing like a simple swipe of beaten egg white. It gave a golden sheen, a crisp snap when bitten, and just enough polish to make it feel like a special occasion. No butter wash, no fancy glaze, just a leftover egg white, whisked and brushed on with a fingertip or scrap of cloth. It was used on both sweet and savory pies, and sometimes even on biscuits or rolls for that bakery look. You could even sprinkle sugar or seeds on top, and the egg white would help it stick. Today's recipes might tell you to use milk or yolk, but the old cooks knew egg whites gave the cleanest, crispest finish. It was quiet elegance from a cupboard that had very little to give. Gravy over rice might sound like a side dish today, but in the 1930s, it was often the main event. When meat was scarce and vegetables were few, the leftover drippings from a roast, or even just some bacon grease and flour, got turned into gravy. Pour that over a pot of plain boiled rice, and suddenly you had dinner. It was salty, it was filling, and it used things that might otherwise go to waste. Gravy made even the blandest starch taste rich, and rice was a cheap staple that went a long way. Families would keep jars of fat and reuse every spoonful, sometimes adding a splash of milk or a bit of onion for extra depth. It was not about variety, it was about sustenance. One bowl of this could keep you full through a whole day's work, and that was all anyone hoped for. Some children grew up thinking this was a real meal, not realizing it was born of necessity. It was practical, thrifty, and as comforting as it was humbling. You did not need a feast. You just needed something hot, salty, and spoonable. The lost trick of dry stone soup is one of the most breathtaking examples of cooking ingenuity hidden in history. In times when pots were scarce or broken, native chefs would still find ways to create nourishing, flavorful stews using nothing but fire-heated rocks and hand-picked herbs. Clean, flat stones were heated in a roaring fire until they almost glowed, then carefully transferred into woven bark baskets or hide-lined pits filled with water and raw ingredients. As the stones boiled the water, fresh roots, wild greens, dried meats, and foraged herbs were added, cooking into rich, smoky broths that filled the air with the scent of earth and flame. The rocks would be swapped out as they cooled, replaced again and again with fresh hot ones, keeping the liquid at a steady simmer. And when it came to sweet treats for the journey ahead, native chefs had one more marvel: crafting rich, chewy fruit leather with nothing but sunlight, fresh air, and the simplest tools imaginable. Leftover ham bone soup was a trick that proved nothing in the kitchen ever had to go to waste. Church ladies could take a single leftover ham bone, one that most people might have tossed, and turn it into a pot that could feed an entire family. By simmering the bone for hours, every bit of flavor and richness was drawn into the broth. Beans, lentils, or whatever garden vegetables were available would be added to bulk it up. This not only stretched the ham to its absolute limit, but also made the soup filling and nourishing. Children might not have realized that what they were eating came from scraps, because it always smelled and tasted like a meal prepared with intention. At church suppers, this kind of dish meant one family's leftovers could become another family's shared meal. Ham bone soup often tasted even better the next day, which meant it carried households through more than one dinner. It showed the quiet wisdom of thrift that church ladies held dear. Nothing was wasted, and everything was put toward filling plates. It was a humble recipe that embodied both economy and generosity. Spam and pineapple skillet suppers were a tropical twist on the thrifty meals that defined the 1960s kitchen. Spam was cheap, filling, and shelf-stable, but it needed a little creativity to keep it interesting night after night. Moms found inspiration in Hawaiian flavors, slicing spam into cubes and browning them before adding canned pineapple chunks for sweetness. The pineapple cut through the saltiness of the spam, and when served over rice or noodles, it became a colorful, filling family dinner. This dish symbolized the way mid-century households embraced convenience foods while still searching for variety. It was inexpensive, it used pantry staples, and it carried just enough flair to feel adventurous. Kids loved the sweet and savory contrast, while parents appreciated how a single can of meat could be stretched into a full meal. Spam and pineapple skillet suppers showed how far a little canned fruit and processed meat could go when guided by ingenuity. Homemade ice cream in coffee cans turned dessert into a family game, avoiding the cost of store-bought ice cream machines. Families filled small cans with cream, sugar, and flavorings, sealed them tight, and placed them inside larger cans packed with ice and salt. Children rolled the cans back and forth across the yard until the mixture inside froze into ice cream. It was cheap entertainment, and dessert rolled into one, and everyone remembered the joy of shaking, rattling, and laughing together. Parents loved it because it used only basic ingredients and kept children busy, while the end result was creamy and satisfying. Ice cream companies certainly did not want people realizing they could make gallons of the treat at home with little effort. This trick represented both thrift and fun, proving that even luxury desserts could be created from household items and a little family effort. It was tradition disguised as play. Pot liquor with cornbread was not just a dish, it was a philosophy of frugality passed down in Southern kitchens. Pot liquor was the leftover cooking liquid from boiling greens such as collards, turnips, or mustard, rich with vitamins and nutrients that seeped into the water. Rather than pour it out, Poor families saved it and sopped it up with chunks of cornbread, creating a meal that cost almost nothing yet was surprisingly nourishing. It was especially valued during times when meat and dairy were scarce, as it provided iron and other nutrients that kept families strong. Many considered it a delicacy despite its humble origins, and the flavor of smoky greens mixed with soft cornbread became a treasured memory. Pot liquor embodied the idea that nothing should go to waste, and even the water from cooking vegetables could become a meal in its own right. It fed generations through poverty and war, and its legacy still lingers in Southern cooking today. What some might see as scraps, poor families saw as opportunity, and pot liquor with cornbread was one of the most ingenious and life-sustaining dishes ever created out of near nothing. Preventing fruit pies from boiling over with a knotted rag sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but your grandma probably did it more than once, and you never gave it a second thought. You would see that pie cooling on the counter, golden brown, bubbling fruit inside, and not a drop of sticky mess oozing down the sides, and wonder how she pulled it off every time. The trick? A simple cloth, damp or dry, tied neatly around the rim of the pie dish. It caught the bubbling juices as they tried to spill over, saving the oven from burnt sugar disasters and keeping the crust neat as a picture. Grandmas never learned these tricks from cooking shows or recipe books. They picked them up at church socials, neighborhood potlucks, or from their own mothers, watching with quiet curiosity. That little knotted rag was one of many unspoken habits tucked into every perfect pie crust and sweet, bubbling filling. The family never asked how the pie stayed so neat. They just ate, smiled, and thanked Grandma for making dessert look and taste like something straight out of a storybook every time. Quick pickling vegetables with vinegar and sugar was pure genius for stretching meals and adding flavor when groceries ran thin. Home cooks back then knew how to make ingredients pull double duty, and pickling was their go-to trick for brightening up plates without fancy seasonings or expensive sides. You would slice up cucumbers, onions, or whatever veggies were on hand, toss them in a mix of vinegar, sugar, salt, and water, and let them sit for a few hours or even minutes. Suddenly, you had tangy, crisp pickles to serve alongside sandwiches, pot roasts, or beans. It added crunch, cut through heavy meals, and made leftovers feel new again. Quick pickles showed up in nearly every old cookbook for a reason. They were fast, cheap, and full of flavor when budgets were tight. It is the kind of trick I wish had landed in my kitchen sooner. How many dull, plain dinners could have been saved with just vinegar, sugar, and a little old-school know-how? Raw onions can bite back. But in the 70s, if you wanted to tame that bite, especially for sandwiches or potato salad, you soaked them in salt water. A quick soak, 10 to 15 minutes, was enough to mellow their sharpness and make them more palatable. They still had crunch, they still had flavor, but the harsh edge softened, and the onion became a background note instead of the star of the show. This trick was especially common in picnic foods and summer dishes. Anything that needed raw onions but not too much kick. Cooks would slice them thin, drop them in a bowl of cold salted water, and let them rest while prepping the rest of the meal. By the time you were ready to serve, the onions were mild, sweet, and ready to blend in. It was not a showy trick, but it was one that stuck around, quietly making meals better with no extra cost. Some things you learn from cookbooks, others you learn by watching someone do it once and then never forgetting it. Saving cereal crumbs might sound like a breakfast problem, but in the 70s it was a dinner solution. The bottom of every box, those tiny broken flakes or puffed bits, were too good to waste. Instead of tossing them out, home cooks swept them into a bowl, crushed them finer with a rolling pin, and used them to coat chicken or pork chops. Cornflakes were the most popular. They gave a golden, crispy crust that clung to meat and stayed crunchy in the oven. Sometimes they were mixed with salt or paprika. Sometimes they were just dumped from the bag onto the plate. Either way, they worked. It was a fast way to fake fried chicken without needing oil or breadcrumbs. The coating crisped up in the oven and fooled most people. It proved dinner did not have to be expensive to taste great. And it taught kids something useful. Nothing should be wasted, not even cereal dust. It might not have looked fancy, but it made for one satisfying crunch. Home economics showed that nature had already designed the perfect cooking vessel, and all it took was a little heat and trust in the process. It was one clever secret everyone was proud to carry home. Making salad dressing from pantry staples was a core skill passed down in nearly every home economics class. Bottled dressing might have been convenient, but teachers insisted that students learn how to whisk oil, vinegar, mustard, and seasoning into something far fresher. The exercise taught ratios, technique, and the importance of balance between fat and acid. A pinch of sugar or herbs could tilt the flavor, and suddenly, a plain bowl of lettuce transformed into something worth eating. Students took pride in creating a creamy vinaigrette or tangy French dressing with their own hands. Families at home quickly noticed when their children dressed salads with something new, something that tasted sharper and brighter than the bottled varieties. It was inexpensive and practical, a lesson that good food did not need to come from a store shelf. Beyond flavor, it showed that independence in the kitchen came from small skills built piece by piece. Students walked away with confidence, knowing they could turn the simplest pantry staples into a polished dish. Home economics elevated salad dressing from an afterthought into a point of pride. Simmering apples with cinnamon was as close to a scented candle as most homes got. But in the 70s, it was not about fragrance. It was about using what you had. A few apples too soft to eat, a splash of water, a little sugar, and cinnamon went into the pot. As it simmered, the house filled with the smell of something warm and familiar. It was fall in a saucepan. You could mash it into applesauce, spoon it over toast, or eat it as dessert. It felt like a treat without effort or extra money. Sometimes clove or nutmeg got added. Other times it stayed plain. Either way, it did two jobs. It used up aging fruit and made the house smell like baking. That kind of trick was gold. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about comfort, thrift, and turning scraps into something special. The smell alone made it worth it. But the taste? That sealed the deal. Crushing saltines as a budget breadcrumb substitute was one of those Depression-era tricks that quietly stuck around, tucked into old cookbooks and recipe cards. Breadcrumbs add crunch to fried food or bind meatballs, but they were not always easy to come by when pantries ran low. Saltine crackers? Almost every household had a box. You would crush them up fine and use them just like breadcrumbs. They added a crispy coating to fried chicken, stretched ground beef and meatloaf, or even worked as a topping for casseroles. It was practical, frugal, and made dinner stretch farther without sacrificing flavor or texture. Families leaned on this hack during tight times, and honestly, it holds up today. I spent way too many years shelling out for fancy breadcrumbs when a box of crackers and a rolling pin would have done the trick. Sometimes old cookbook tricks really do make the most sense. Making biscuits taller with buttermilk and patience was an art form your grandma probably perfected behind closed doors, long before biscuit mix came in a box. You ever notice how her biscuits stood high and proud, golden on the outside, soft and fluffy with those flaky layers you could peel apart one by one? That was no accident, and it definitely was not beginner's luck. It all started with ice-cold buttermilk, the real deal, chilled straight from the icebox. She poured it gently, keeping the dough cool and loose so the biscuits stayed airy and never dense. But the real magic was patience. She handled that dough soft and slow, barely touching it, folding it with care, never overworking it, never rushing. Biscuits did not like to be fussed with, and Grandma knew every shortcut or heavy hand could ruin them. She never explained it, probably just smiled when those biscuits rose taller than your coffee mug, layers pulling apart like pages of a book. You would bite in, warm steam escaping, never realizing every perfect biscuit came from years of quiet practice, knowing the old ways, respecting the process, and keeping her kitchen secrets tucked away for those lucky enough to sit at the table. Grated apple as a sugar substitute was one of the best-kept secrets of Depression baking. When sugar was rationed or simply too expensive to justify, people turned to fruit, especially apples, to sweeten their dishes naturally. You would peel them, grate them fine, and fold the pulp into cakes, breads, or puddings to bring moisture and sweetness without using up precious pantry staples. It was not the exact same as sugar, but it worked surprisingly well. The apples added flavor, kept things tender, and helped stretch recipes that otherwise would have come up short. Sometimes you would use them on their own. Other times they got mixed with a spoonful or two of whatever sugar you had left, just to bring it over the line. Tart apples like Granny Smith worked best in baked goods, while sweeter varieties were used in cold puddings or compotes. The trick was simple, but it made a big difference. Every apple grated was a little gift back to the kitchen, a way of saying, "We are not out yet." Even now, a lot of older recipes still carry the echoes of this trick. Stuffed cabbage with grain fillers was a shining example of kitchen ingenuity in hard times. Cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around a filling of ground meat stretched with rice, oats, or even mashed potatoes. The grains weren't just filler. They turned a half-pound of meat into a full family meal. These rolls were baked in tomato sauce or simmered on the stove, letting the flavors meld. The dish was cheap, satisfying, and easy to make in large batches. It also drew from Eastern European traditions brought over by immigrants who knew how to stretch ingredients wisely. During wartime, meals like this weren't just clever, they were necessary. Government booklets encouraged home cooks to stretch meat wherever possible, and this dish did just that: efficient, nourishing, and delicious. Some families skipped meat altogether, using seasoned rice and onions. But no matter how you made it, stuffed cabbage always meant the same thing. Someone took time to roll and wrap dinner by hand. Bread pudding was born out of thrift and necessity, and it was one of the sweetest tricks poor families held on to during the lean years. When loaves of bread grew stale and too hard for sandwiches, mothers refused to toss them out. Instead, they soaked the cubes in milk, added a little sugar or molasses, and baked them until the dish puffed up golden brown. If eggs were available, they went in too, but the recipe worked with whatever could be spared. Raisins, cinnamon, or even scraps of leftover jam sometimes found their way into the mix to give it more character. The result was a dessert that felt indulgent without costing anything extra. For children, it was often the only sweet treat they saw in a week, and for parents, it was proof that resourcefulness could turn waste into joy. Bread pudding tasted like comfort, and more than that, it tasted like resilience. Stretching pancake batter with applesauce was a clever way to feed more mouths without needing extra flour, milk, or eggs. Applesauce was inexpensive, often sold in large jars, and added both sweetness and moisture that made pancakes fluffier. Mom stirred a scoop into the batter, which not only stretched the yield, but also created a tender texture that families loved. It was a subtle trick that transformed a small batch of ingredients into enough pancakes to fill the breakfast table. Kids thought they were simply getting a new flavor, but parents knew it was a budget-friendly hack that kept everyone satisfied without requiring another trip to the store. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg was added for extra flair, giving the pancakes a warmth that felt comforting. This method also worked for waffles or quick breads, proving its versatility. It became a go-to trick for mornings when groceries were running low, but family appetites were high. Making mayonnaise by hand was a test of endurance and technique in home economics classrooms. Students learned to whisk egg yolks while slowly adding oil, drop by drop, until the mixture thickened into creamy emulsion. Too fast and it would separate, too slow and it would feel endless. Teachers explained that patience was the real ingredient, along with a steady wrist. Vinegar, lemon juice, and mustard could be added for flavor, but the lesson was about control. It was not only mayonnaise they were making, it was the skill of turning simple parts into something unified. Most students found it exhausting, yet rewarding once the thick spread finally appeared in the bowl. The pride of spreading homemade mayonnaise on bread after such effort was unforgettable. While jars from the store eventually replaced the habit, students remembered the cleverness of knowing it could be made from scratch if needed. It was both practical and empowering. Two-day mashed potatoes showed that yesterday's dinner could become today's favorite without wasting a single spoonful. After Sunday supper, Grandma saved every bit of mashed potato in a cool crock, then mixed the leftovers with a beaten egg flour and a sprinkle of herbs the next evening. She shaped the mixture into small cakes or croquettes and fried them in a hot skillet until golden and crisp outside while remaining fluffy within. Served with gravy or eaten by hand, these potato cakes were eagerly awaited by children who claimed they tasted even better than the original mash. This tradition turned a common side dish into a highlight of the week and taught everyone that leftovers were opportunities, not burdens. Families embraced the ritual knowing that nothing from the previous meal would go unnoticed or unused. Each bite carried the quiet satisfaction of thrift and the joy of making something delightful from what might otherwise have been forgotten. Making salad dressing in a washed-out ketchup bottle might sound like a stretch, but to a 1950s housewife, it was second nature. Once the bottle was empty, she would rinse it with hot water, add oil, vinegar, mustard, salt, sugar, and whatever herbs she had on hand. Then she would shake it up. No blender, no mess, just good old-fashioned elbow grease. That ketchup bottle became a reliable dressing shaker, ready whenever needed. It poured easily, stored well in the fridge, and cost nothing extra. You did not need to buy fancy bottles or mixers. You already had what you needed. It was clever, resourceful, and oddly satisfying. This trick came from the same spirit that saved string in a jar or foil in a drawer. Waste nothing. Use everything. Even if the bottle was glass, it still did its job. Housewives loved having control over their ingredients, especially with young kids at the table. No artificial flavors, just what they made themselves. Today we chase clean eating and low-waste trends. But back then, those ideas just meant doing things the smart way. And sometimes that meant turning trash into treasure with nothing more than a good shake. Dough fluffing with vinegar and baking soda was one of those chemistry tricks that made you feel like a magician in the kitchen. No eggs? No problem. A splash of vinegar in your batter, mixed with baking soda, gave just enough lift to make pancakes, muffins, or quick breads rise like they had all the right ingredients. It fizzed as soon as you stirred it in, and you had to work fast. Those bubbles did not last forever. But if you timed it right, you got a tender crumb and a soft center without needing eggs or even milk. It was a lifesaver when rationing hit or when payday was still a few days away. Vinegar was cheap, baking soda was shelf-stable, and together they turned nothing into something. Modern recipes tend to leave this out, pushing people toward eggs or dairy substitutes. But vinegar and soda were the real original hack. They worked quietly, without a fuss, and gave families hot breakfasts and passable cakes even in the leanest times. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Vinegar pie filling thickener was one of those odd tricks that worked better than it had any right to. Older fruit pies often came out runny, too sweet, or flat. A splash of vinegar helped in two ways. First, it cut the sugary taste and brought the fruit's brightness back. Second, it helped the flour or starch bind the filling together. Some even said it helped fruit hold its shape. You saw this most in old apple or berry pies, where just a teaspoon gave the flavor a sharp little kick. It was not something most people noticed, but if it was missing, you could tell. The sharp smell faded in the oven, leaving behind something more balanced. A clean slice, no leaks. Some tricks are bold. This one just did its job, and did it well. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine, it was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters through long hunting trips and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Baking with sorghum syrup was a trick that came from times when sugar was too costly or scarce. Sorghum, grown in fields across the South, was boiled down into a thick, sweet syrup. It was cheaper, plentiful, and stored well, making it the perfect stand-in for sugar in cakes, cookies, and breads. Grandfathers often recalled how the deep, earthy sweetness of sorghum gave baked goods a unique flavor that store-bought sugar never matched. Families grew to love the taste, and recipes were passed down through generations. Using sorghum also meant independence, since it could be produced locally rather than purchased. During lean years, it made baking possible when other sweeteners were out of reach. A drizzle of sorghum on biscuits or cornbread was a treat in itself. It was more than just a substitute. It was a reminder of how creativity and resourcefulness kept kitchens alive. Sorghum syrup was not just sweet, it was survival made delicious. Boiling pasta without sticking may sound too obvious to teach, but in home economics class, it was a point of pride. Teachers explained that pasta needed plenty of boiling water, a pinch of salt, and careful timing so that noodles did not clump together. A wooden spoon kept things moving, but so did the practice of stirring once in a while. Students discovered that rinsing was not always necessary, and that oil was never the trick that commercials made it seem. It was knowledge passed down like a family secret, but with the authority of the classroom. When pasta came out tender but not mushy, students realized they had control over something that had once seemed finicky. The lesson was not only about noodles, but about confidence in boiling, draining, and timing. It was clever in its simplicity, and it made pasta dinners feel just a little more special when the whole pot came out perfect. Vegetable garden stone soup turned neighborhood generosity into a steaming pot of nourishment on cool evenings when everyone's harvest was thin. Families gathered with baskets of odds and ends, half a cabbage, a handful of beans, a few carrots or onions, and Grandma welcomed them all into one large kettle. As the vegetables simmered together, their flavors mingled into a fragrant broth far richer than any single ingredient. Children chased each other while adults shared stories around the fire, waiting for the soup that belonged to everyone. No one worried about exact measures or missing spices because the real recipe was cooperation and trust. When the ladle finally dipped into the golden liquid, each neighbor left with a warm bowl and a deeper sense of belonging. The meal cost almost nothing, yet fed hearts as much as stomachs, proving that community spirit could turn scraps into a banquet, and that sharing was the most filling ingredient of all. Leftover mashed potatoes turned into pancakes was a breakfast staple for families who refused to waste a single spoonful. The process was simple. You took cold, firm mashed potatoes, added a bit of flour or egg, and dropped the mixture into a hot skillet. Crisp on the outside, soft on the inside. It was comforting, filling, and downright thrifty. Housewives in the 1950s knew better than to toss leftovers. Potatoes were cheap, yes, but not so cheap you could afford to throw them out. These pancakes stretched a single dish across meals and added warmth to the morning. You could dress them up with chopped onions, garlic, or even leftover bits of cheese. Fried in bacon grease or butter, they gave off the kind of smell that made a kitchen feel alive. Kids loved them, husbands praised them, and moms appreciated the ease. Leftover night did not always mean boring. It meant clever. It meant knowing how to make something new out of what had already served its purpose. These potato pancakes did not just fill bellies, they proved that a little imagination could go a long, long way. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, The browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from: roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. Boiled salad dressing was the grandmother of everything that came before the grocery aisle. Back before bottled ranch or ready-made vinaigrettes, home cooks whipped up dressings from scratch using what they had in the pantry. This particular one was a little tangy, a little sweet, and usually started with vinegar, sugar, egg yolks, and a bit of mustard powder. Everything was whisked together in a saucepan and cooked low until it thickened like a custard. The result was creamy and tart, perfect for potato salad, coleslaw, or even spooned over hard-boiled eggs. Some versions added flour or cornstarch to help it hold better in the fridge, while others kept it simple. It might not have had the smooth pour of modern dressings, but it had soul and a flavor people still remember. You would find it tucked into the back pages of church cookbooks, labeled Grandma's Dressing or Sweet Egg Sauce. When chilled, it firmed up a little, which made it ideal for picnic salads that had to last in the summer sun. It tasted like resourcefulness, it tasted like memory, and it was surprisingly good. Cooking over aromatic wood like cedar was not just about building a fire. It was about infusing every meal with a living, breathing memory of the forest. Cedar, mesquite, alder, and hickory were prized not only for their heat, but for their ability to lend food an unmistakable perfume. Smoky, sweet, slightly bitter, and deeply grounding. Native chefs knew exactly which woods would turn a plain cut of fish or meat into something unforgettable. Fresh salmon might be roasted low over cedar planks, absorbing the wood's oils and scent, while rich game meats might get a kiss of mesquite's sharper bite. These woods were more than fuel. They were ingredients, carefully chosen like spices. And when it came to protecting meats from drying out or burning, native chefs did not just stop at wood. They found a way to wrap their food in the earth itself, locking in flavor with a method so smart it almost feels magical. Making coffee with eggshells may sound strange now, but it was an old trick that made sense in its time. Your grandfather would save clean eggshells, crush them, and stir them into the pot of boiling coffee grounds. The shells drew out bitterness, settled the grounds, and left the coffee clearer and smoother. It was especially common when brewing coffee over campfires or on stovetops without filters. The calcium in the shells worked like a natural clarifier, making the drink easier on the stomach. Back then, coffee was precious and no one wanted to waste it or choke down a bitter cup. This trick gave every pot a mellow flavor that store-bought blends could not match. It was simple, cheap, and effective, the kind of trick passed down by word of mouth rather than written in a book. It showed that clever thinking could turn even the most ordinary morning into something quietly remarkable. Hiding leftover meat in rice-stuffed peppers was one of those quiet, practical kitchen moves Grandma perfected without ever drawing attention to it. You would glance at those colorful peppers stuffed high with rice, herbs, and sauce, and think dinner was something fresh and fancy, but really, it was thrift and know-how in every bite. Grandma slipped yesterday's roast, bits of sausage, even scraps of ground meat right into the filling, stretching what little was left into a meal that felt generous and filling. The rice bulked it up, the sauce brought it together, and suddenly leftovers disappeared into something new, hearty, and satisfying. Grandmas never wasted a crumb, but they also never made a show of it. Dinner showed up, steaming hot, tasting like a full-course feast, and no one suspected the leftovers hiding inside. That quiet trick kept plates full, stretched budgets, and turned barely enough into plenty to go around. Fried potato skins were a shining example of the rule that nothing could be wasted in a poor household. When potatoes were peeled for soups or stews, the skins were not discarded but saved, washed, and fried in fat until they turned crisp. Sprinkled with salt, they became a cheap side dish or snack that added a bit of variety to meals that were otherwise repetitive. Children often loved them because they were crunchy and fun to eat, like a homemade chip. Parents valued them because they made use of every part of the potato, turning scraps into food. In communities where bartering was common, fried skins were even traded for other small goods, proving their worth beyond the dinner table. This dish taught families the value of thrift in the kitchen, where waste was not an option. Fried potato skins might have been born of necessity, but they ended up being one of the most beloved frugal tricks that turned scraps into satisfaction. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers was one of the cleverest desserts to come out of kitchens that had to make something from nothing. Instead of apples, families used crushed crackers soaked with sugar syrup, lemon juice, and a bit of cinnamon, baking it all in a flaky crust. The crackers softened and took on the texture of apples, fooling almost anyone into believing they were eating real fruit. Food companies promoted it to sell crackers, but housewives embraced it as a secret hack that made dessert possible without expensive produce. At the table, no one cared if apples were missing. The flavor was close enough, and the joy of pie was still there. Children thought it was a marvel, and adults appreciated the thrift behind it. This dish showed that resourcefulness was sometimes more impressive than luxury, proving that flavor did not always depend on what you had, but on what you could make out of very little. Orange Julius copycats were the mall treat that made its way into every thrifty household blender. Housewives learned that a can of frozen orange juice concentrate, blended with milk, sugar, and sometimes a splash of vanilla, created the same frothy drink without the trip downtown. Children begged for them after school, husbands enjoyed them on hot afternoons, and neighbors saw them as proof that homemakers could replicate anything. The mixture was creamy, sweet, and refreshing, a little luxury that cost only pennies per serving. It was thick enough to pass for indulgent but still light enough to feel wholesome, which fit perfectly with the health-conscious trends of the decade. Housewives clipped variations of the recipe from magazines and passed them around at church gatherings, each one swearing hers tasted just like the real thing. The magic was not just in the flavor, but in the feeling of beating the system, of making store-bought luxury at home. Flour and salt meat stretchers were not about taste. They were about survival and smart thinking. When a pound of meat had to feed 6 or 7 people, there was no room for waste. Home cooks would mix the meat with a cup or 2 of flour, sometimes seasoned with pepper or dried herbs, and add a heavy pinch of salt. That mixture got turned into patties, crumbles, or meatballs. The flour made it stick together, and the salt helped pull out the flavor from the scraps of beef or pork. Sometimes an egg was added, sometimes not. Fried in a pan or baked in a loaf tin, it held its shape and filled the plate. Kids did not ask what was in it. They were just glad to have a warm dinner with something meaty at the center. These stretchers kept food on the table long after the groceries had run out. You will not find this trick in today's glossy cookbooks. Nobody wants to admit that flour can make meat go twice as far, but ask anyone who lived through the hard years, and they will tell you it was a trick worth knowing. Buttermilk substitutes kept baking day alive when the real thing was nowhere to be found. Grandma simply stirred a spoon of vinegar or a squeeze of lemon juice into regular milk and let it sit until tiny curds formed, giving the liquid the same tang and tenderizing power as true buttermilk. Biscuits, pancakes, and cornbread rose high and fluffy as if nothing had changed. This trick saved both time and money, while teaching younger cooks that flexibility in the kitchen mattered more than perfect ingredients. The slight acidity added depth of flavor that some preferred to the original, and many kept using the method even when buttermilk was back in stock. It was a quiet reminder that know-how could outlast shortages and that a clever cook never let the lack of a single item halt a meal. Every golden loaf or tender cake from that mixture carried the taste of ingenuity and the comfort of resourceful tradition. Powdered milk to bulk up regular milk was not glamorous, but it sure was dependable. In big families with small budgets, milk disappeared fast, so housewives made it stretch by mixing whole milk with reconstituted powdered milk. You took a scoop of the powder, stirred it with water, and poured it into the fresh stuff to double the supply. It was not just thrift, it was survival. This trick made sure every child got a glass at breakfast, every recipe had enough for batter, and every cup of coffee got its splash of creaminess. Did it taste different? A little. But after a while, no one noticed. It became part of the routine. When you have mouths to feed and only so much to go around, a full jug matters more than the taste of a second pour. Powdered milk also stored longer and did not require refrigeration until mixed. That made it perfect for backup in a pinch. Housewives kept boxes in the pantry like it was gold dust. And truth be told, it kinda was. It gave a little more breathing room to a grocery bill that was already tight. Turning leftover bread into bread pudding was a sweet reward for paying attention. Home economics teachers showed how cubes of stale bread could be whisked with eggs, sugar, milk, and spices to create something warm and comforting. Students realized that nothing in the kitchen had to go to waste if you knew the right trick. This pudding became a lesson in thrift as well as dessert, proving that even the oldest loaf had value. The mixture baked into something golden, soft, and fragrant, filling the classroom with the smell of cinnamon or nutmeg. It was dessert without extravagance, made from scraps and a little imagination. The point was not only flavor, but also resourcefulness, a reminder that clever cooks could turn yesterday's leftovers into today's highlight. Many students remembered the first spoonful as proof that food did not need to be expensive to feel like a treat. That was the lasting charm of bread pudding in the classroom. The cheese ball party trick was a revelation in its time, and no holiday table was complete without one. Housewives mixed cream cheese with dried beef, scallions, or herbs, rolled it into a sphere, and coated it in chopped nuts to give it flair. It looked extravagant, but in truth it was inexpensive, easy, and endlessly adaptable. A few simple ingredients transformed into a showpiece that impressed neighbors and entertained guests. It became a centerpiece of cocktail parties with crackers lined neatly around it, and guests breaking off pieces as if it were something gourmet. The trick was that it could be made hours or even a day in advance, saving time for the host. Housewives loved anything that made them look polished without spending too much money or labor. It was not just cheese, it was social confidence shaped into a ball. The 70s were full of gatherings, and this recipe proved that you did not need wealth to make a statement. Pressure-cooked chicken was a revelation before slow cookers became the standard in American homes, and church ladies embraced it with open arms. Using stovetop pressure cookers, they could turn tough or inexpensive cuts of poultry into tender, juicy meals in a fraction of the time it normally took. This was a godsend for busy families and for women preparing large meals for church suppers, because it saved both hours and money. Instead of roasting for long stretches, chicken could be cooked quickly, with the pressure sealing in flavor. The meat was moist, the broth rich, and the process efficient enough to keep up with the pace of community gatherings. Recipes for pressure-cooked chicken often appeared in church cookbooks, teaching new cooks how to master the technique. For families on tight budgets, this trick meant they could make poultry stretch further without losing quality. It was clever, practical, and delicious, the kind of trick that showed church ladies always knew how to work smarter in the kitchen. Keeping lettuce crisp with damp towels was one of those quiet tricks that every grandfather seemed to know without ever needing a manual. Refrigerators with crisper drawers were not common in every household, so a simple towel soaked lightly in water became the next best thing. Lettuce heads would be wrapped gently and stored in a cool corner or ice box. The damp cloth slowed wilting, kept leaves from drying out, and added days of freshness to a vegetable that otherwise spoiled quickly. Families depended on greens for salads, sandwiches, and suppers, and wasting even one head of lettuce felt like throwing away money. The towel method stretched groceries further and kept meals looking more appetizing. A plate of limp, tired lettuce was never as welcome as one with crisp, bright leaves. This clever trick was taught in kitchens and passed quietly across generations, a testament to making do with little. Today, many people do not even think about it, but back then, a damp towel was the line between waste and dinner. Using charcoal powder to enhance meat flavor and aid digestion sounds almost too wild to be real, but for Native American cooks, it was a smart, practical tool built from hard-earned wisdom. After a fire burned down to pure white coals, small amounts of fine charcoal powder were sometimes sprinkled over cooking meats or even mixed into marinades. The charcoal acted as a natural purifier, absorbing toxins and helping break down tough fibers inside the meat, making it not only more flavorful but also easier on the stomach. Some healers even mixed tiny amounts into drinking water after big meals, trusting charcoal's natural ability to soothe digestion and guard against sickness. It tasted like the earth, the fire, and the sky, all wrapped up into one unforgettable bite. And if you thought using charcoal was clever, wait until you hear about how deer fat candles turned slow basting into an art form that even today's chefs can barely rival. Oven-dried breadcrumb savor was less of a recipe and more of a way of life. Any time you had bread that went stale, and back then that was often, you dried it out in the oven, crushed it by hand, and stored it for later. Nothing got tossed. These homemade crumbs were used for coating fish, thickening soups, binding meatloaf, and topping baked casseroles. A batch could last weeks if you kept it dry and cool. Some people seasoned them with herbs or garlic powder, while others kept them plain and let the dish carry the flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 1950s listed breadcrumbs as an everyday ingredient, not something you bought at the store. They called them pantry gold and treated them with care. It was a small step toward stretching every meal and making use of everything, and it came with that quiet pride of not letting good food go to waste. These crumbs had a texture you could not get from store-bought. More rustic, more honest. They turned the ordinary into something that felt home-cooked and personal. Jarred pickle juice reuse was Grandma's secret weapon for squeezing every drop of flavor from a pantry staple most people poured down the drain. After the last pickle disappeared, she saved the brine to boil small potatoes or to quick marinate carrots, onions, or even sliced cabbage. The salty tang and faint dill turned plain vegetables into lively sides with almost no effort or expense. Sometimes she splashed the brine into salad dressings or stirred it into deviled egg filling for an unexpected spark that guests could never quite name. Each reuse stretched a single jar through multiple meals, proving that nothing in her kitchen was ever truly finished. Children watched in fascination as leftovers transformed with a simple pour and learned that frugality could taste bright and exciting. That reused brine carried memories of summer gardens and winter suppers alike while teaching everyone that flavor often hides in what others throw away. Frozen orange juice cakes delivered brightness to even the simplest gatherings. Housewives discovered that concentrated frozen orange juice added zing to pound cakes, icings, and glazes, creating desserts that felt fresh without relying on costly produce. A spoonful of concentrate packed more punch than squeezing oranges, and it kept well in the freezer. Pound cakes livened up with orange zest became a crowd pleaser at potlucks and coffee hours. It was a shortcut that elevated simple baking into something memorable, proving that a small trick could carry big impact. Housewives cherished recipes that turned pantry staples into desserts that wowed guests, and this was one of the best. Pickled okra was one of those clever preserving tricks that kept garden bounty on the table long after summer ended. Church ladies would fill jars with okra pods, vinegar, garlic, and spices, sealing them up to store for the months ahead. The brine softened the vegetable just enough while keeping its crunch, creating a tangy, flavorful side that paired well with heavy meals. At potlucks, a jar of pickled okra could cut through the richness of casseroles and meats, adding variety and brightness. Families who grew okra in backyard gardens relied on this method to prevent waste, turning surplus harvests into something special. It was also a clever way to bring color and texture to cold weather meals when fresh vegetables were harder to find. The jars themselves lined pantry shelves like jewels, each one a testament to planning and thrift. Pickled okra was more than food. It was a sign of care, ensuring nothing went to waste and every meal had balance. Smoking fish with wild berries for a natural glaze was one of those strokes of genius that blended necessity and creativity in perfect balance. Freshly caught fish were rubbed or brushed with mashed wild berries like cranberries, chokecherries, or elderberries, then carefully smoked over low, aromatic fires. The natural sugars in the berries caramelized slowly in the smoke, forming a delicate, flavorful glaze that locked in moisture and added a subtle, tangy sweetness to every bite. It was preservation and flavor enhancement rolled into one breathtaking technique. The berry glaze also helped protect the fish from drying out too fast or attracting insects during the long smoking process. But the magic of earthborn cooking did not stop at meat. Deep underground and right in the fire itself, native chefs had another trick: roasting tough, stubborn root vegetables until they were sweet, tender, and full of hidden strength. Shredded carrot in gelatin salads was a strange but oddly elegant touch that showed up all over mid-century kitchens. Back when gelatin was not just dessert, but a full-blown meal format, people liked to add texture and color to their wobbly molds. Enter the humble carrot, shredded fine and stirred into orange or lemon gelatin for a bright, crunchy twist. The sweetness of the gelatin and the mild earthiness of the carrot balanced surprisingly well, and the end result was a chilled salad that looked like sunshine on a plate. You would find it served at potlucks, funerals, church luncheons, and any meal where presentation mattered more than explanation. Sometimes folks added pineapple or raisins too, giving it a sweet-sour profile that people either loved or politely ignored. Still, the shredded carrot stuck around because it was easy, inexpensive, and made the mold feel a little more like food and less like decoration. It is one of those dishes people remember from their grandmother's house, even if they never quite liked it. But in its own weird way, it was beautiful. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed. Others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Pot and pot steaming was a workaround so clever it made most kitchen gadgets look unnecessary. No steamer basket? No problem. You just nested a smaller pot or bowl inside a larger one filled with a little water, covered the whole thing tightly, and let the steam do its job. Vegetables came out soft but not soggy. Dumplings puffed up like clouds, and even old bread could be gently rewarmed without drying out. You had to keep an eye on the water level so it would not boil dry, but once you got the hang of it, this method became second nature. It was quiet cooking. No sizzling, no flipping. Just warm air lifting food to the finish line. People used it for everything from puddings to tamales. Today, we buy tiered steamers and electric setups, but this old trick used what you already had. It turned basic pots into tools of precision, all without spending a dollar. And for many home cooks, that made all the difference. Using mayonnaise as a moisture booster in cakes was one of those tricks that seemed odd on the surface, but in practice, it worked wonders. Housewives in the 1950s were always looking for ways to keep baked goods soft and rich without using up precious butter or eggs. Mayonnaise, made from oil and eggs, added fat and moisture without affecting the flavor too much. In fact, when added to chocolate cakes or spice cakes, it made them taste even better, deeper, smoother, and softer. You would mix a few spoonfuls right into the batter, and suddenly your scratch cake had the texture of something made at a high-end bakery. You did not need frosting to make it enjoyable. The moisture locked in so well you could eat it plain with coffee. This trick became a hit at school bake sales, church potlucks, and family dinners. It was also a quiet lifesaver when ingredients were limited or rationed. If you had mayonnaise in the fridge, you had cake potential. People back then knew how to stretch what they had and still make it feel like a treat. Today, it sounds like a shortcut, but back then, it was a stroke of genius. Clever, practical, and unforgettable. Oatmeal. Meat patties brought wholesome grains into the supper spotlight when meat was scarce and appetites were large. Grandma blended rolled oats with a modest amount of ground beef onions and herbs, forming patties that held together beautifully once seared on a hot skillet. The oats absorbed savory juices, creating a tender bite that tasted richer than its humble ingredients suggested. Served with brown gravy or nestled into soft rolls, these patties delivered satisfying protein while stretching a single pound of beef to feed a full family. Children often asked for seconds without ever guessing that oats were doing most of the work. For busy parents, the recipe offered a double reward of lower cost and hearty nutrition. In an era when nothing could be wasted, this dish showed how a pantry staple meant for breakfast could carry the main course with quiet brilliance and keep bellies full long after the plates were cleared. Cooking potatoes in their skins was a simple yet important lesson that showed how much nutrition could be saved with one change. Teachers explained that peeling potatoes stripped away vitamins and fiber, while leaving skins on preserved them. Students learned to scrub potatoes well and boil or bake them whole. The result was tender flesh with added flavor from the skins. It also saved time in preparation and cut down on waste. Families at home often knew this trick, but in classrooms it became a formal part of nutrition lessons. Potatoes were a staple on nearly every table, so learning to cook them better made a real difference. Students realized that even small shifts in method improved both health and thrift. The lesson carried forward into mashed potatoes with skins, baked potatoes, or potato salads with more substance. Home economics gave everyday staples a healthier twist without extra cost. It was a reminder that wisdom often came in the simplest forms. Leftover mashed potato pancakes were a clever way to avoid waste, turning cold potatoes into something new and golden. Housewives mixed the leftovers with a little flour or egg, shaping patties and frying them until crisp on the outside and soft inside. Served with a dab of applesauce or gravy, they became a breakfast favorite that made yesterday's supper feel fresh again. This simple trick kept nothing from going to waste, proving that leftovers did not need to be boring. Families loved the texture, and children looked forward to them almost as much as the original meal. They were quick, affordable, and comforting, embodying the creativity of kitchens that made the most of every scrap. Salmon patties from canned fish were a budget-friendly way to bring protein to the table during the 1960s. Canned salmon was inexpensive, lasted a long time in the pantry, and could be mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and eggs to form patties that were fried until golden. The result was similar to crab cakes but far cheaper, and they could be served with potatoes, vegetables, or tucked into sandwiches. Moms appreciated how quickly they came together and how much nutrition they delivered without breaking the budget. Kids often enjoyed them with ketchup, making them both familiar and comforting. This clever trick turned a humble can of fish into a meal that felt hearty and satisfying, proving once again that resourcefulness defined the family dinner table. Salmon patties became a staple in many households, remembered for their flavor, thrift, and the pride moms took in making the most of what was available. Miracle Whip salad dressing was a secret weapon in fruit salads and slaws, offering a tangy sweetness that regular mayonnaise lacked. Housewives relied on it when they wanted to make dishes stand out without adding expensive ingredients. Grapes, apples, or shredded cabbage tasted brighter when dressed in it, turning simple produce into something special. It became the dressing of choice for picnics and church suppers, with recipes passed around between friends. The balance of sweet and tangy fooled people into thinking it was a unique family recipe, even though it came straight from a jar. It was affordable, easy, and dependable, which was exactly what busy households needed. Miracle Whip was not just a condiment, it was a kitchen trick to make ordinary dishes taste fresh. It is the kind of thing that made 70s cooking feel both practical and playful at once. Zucchini bread was born out of necessity when church gardens were overflowing with more zucchini than anyone could eat. Instead of letting them go to waste, church ladies grated the extra squash into batter, turning a humble vegetable into a moist and sweet loaf. With cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, the zucchini blended right in, leaving behind only a soft texture and rich flavor. At bake sales, slices of zucchini bread were wrapped and sold quickly, often becoming one of the most popular items. The cleverness was in transforming an unwanted surplus into something comforting and profitable. Families appreciated it too, because kids who might wrinkle their noses at zucchini happily ate it when it was baked into bread. It was also a frugal trick, since it stretched flour, eggs, and sugar into more servings without using extra costly ingredients. For many, the smell of zucchini bread cooling on the counter became tied to church events and fall harvests. It was proof that nothing needed to go to waste if you had creativity in the kitchen. Sweet, simple, and resourceful, zucchini bread became a classic church recipe for good reason. Using newspaper to ripen fruit was one of those small, clever fixes that worked without fancy gadgets. When tomatoes or bananas were still green, your grandfather would wrap them in newspaper and leave them in a warm corner of the house. The trapped gases and warmth helped them ripen faster and more evenly. It was cheap, practical, and surprisingly reliable. Back then, wasting fruit was unthinkable, so this method gave every harvest a second chance. Families used it to bring in tomatoes from the garden before the frost or to make store-bought bananas ready for baking. The newspaper trick turned waiting days into just a night or two, keeping meals on schedule without spending extra money. It was not something written in manuals, but passed down from experience and observation. Today we buy fruit ready-made, but once upon a time, ripening your own was part of daily life, and everyone knew how. The trick to tenderizing cheaper meat cuts was one of the most practical lessons. Students learned that marinating in vinegar, tomato juice, or even buttermilk broke down the toughness and made meat taste better without extra cost. Teachers demonstrated with flank steak or round cuts, showing how acid worked over time. It was a revelation for teenagers who had only known expensive roasts or fried chicken. Suddenly, a tough, chewy cut became tender enough for a family dinner. Seasonings and patience were part of the lesson, but the real skill was in knowing how to make the most of what you had. The savings were obvious, but so was the satisfaction of learning a professional trick in a school kitchen. It proved that good meals did not depend on money, but on knowledge. This was clever cooking at its best, and students carried it with them long after. Pickle roll-ups became a surprise favorite in lunchboxes and potlucks, and they proved how far simple pantry items could be stretched. Housewives would smear cream cheese across slices of deli ham, place a pickle in the center, and roll the whole thing into a tidy bundle. Once sliced into bite-sized pieces, they looked almost gourmet, despite being assembled in minutes. Children loved pulling them apart in lunchboxes, while adults popped them like appetizers at neighborhood gatherings. They offered a crunchy, tangy bite wrapped in something hearty enough to pass for indulgence. Cream cheese smoothed out the saltiness, while the pickle added both flavor and texture, making it a clever balance of taste on a budget. It was proof that fun presentation could make even the simplest ingredients feel party-worthy. A few slices of ham, a jar of pickles, and some cheese created a dish that stood out on any table. Vienna sausages wrapped in crescent dough were one of the era's most popular party tricks, combining frugality with fun. Crescent roll dough came in refrigerated tubes that made baking simple, while canned Vienna sausages were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand. Moms wrapped small sausages in triangles of dough, baked them until golden, and served them as appetizers that looked festive without requiring much money or time. These bite-sized treats felt indulgent at potlucks or parties, giving the illusion of abundance even when budgets were thin. Kids loved them because they were playful finger food, and adults appreciated them as a clever way to make canned meat feel special. They showed how presentation could elevate even the humblest ingredients, turning ordinary pantry staples into something worthy of celebration. Vienna sausages wrapped in crescent dough remain a nostalgic reminder of how 1960s moms brought joy and ingenuity to their kitchens, even when resources were limited. Apple cider vinegar drinks, often called switchel, were the forgotten energy drink of farm families who worked long days under the sun. Mixed from vinegar, ginger, molasses or honey, and water, switchel was refreshing, inexpensive, and practical for laborers who needed hydration. Farmers carried it in jugs into the fields, sipping steadily to stay cool and energized without buying soda or bottled drinks. Children often drank it watered down and remembered the sharp tang as a taste tied to summers of heat and harvest. Housewives admired that it cost only pennies to make compared to store-bought beverages, especially during times when families guarded every cent. Food companies tried marketing alternatives, but switchel held on in rural areas because it was reliable, flavorful, and connected to the cycles of work and community. Though it has largely disappeared today, its place once stood as vital, offering both nourishment and comfort. Families could always mix another jug, knowing it was their own, homemade, sustaining drink. Corn fritters were another staple of survival kitchens, born out of the love for cornmeal and the convenience of canned corn. Families mixed flour, baking powder, and a few spoonfuls of corn into a batter and fried it in oil or drippings until golden and crisp. The result was a cheap side dish that paired with soups, stews, or even just a glass of milk. Corn fritters filled stomachs while offering a little crunch and sweetness, which made them feel special compared to plain bread. Kids loved them because they resembled little pancakes, and parents appreciated that they required almost no ingredients. For families living on very little, corn fritters were proof that something humble could still taste delightful. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Orange juice glazed carrots were the kind of dinner party dish that felt fancier than it was. Carrots were cheap and easy to store, but no one really got excited about them until you added a splash of orange juice and a bit of butter. The acid in the juice softened the carrots just right, while the sugars caramelized slightly, giving everything a glossy finish. It made a plain root vegetable taste bright, warm, and a little unexpected. This trick started appearing in cookbooks in the 1950s and really caught on in the 1960s when citrus became a trendy flavor in savory foods. Some cooks added a dash of honey or cinnamon, while others left it clean and simple. It was easy to make, easy to scale for a crowd, and looked beautiful on the plate. This was the kind of side dish that made people feel like they were eating something a little more refined, even when it cost barely $1 to make. A little citrus went a long way, and carrots never looked back. Zwieback toast was the kind of food that got made, stored, and reused until there was nothing left but crumbs. Originally a German recipe, Zwieback is twice-baked bread, meaning it is baked once, sliced, and then dried out in the oven until crisp. During the 1930s, it became a go-to staple for households trying to stretch bread that was starting to go stale. The result was crunchy, dry, and perfect for storing without refrigeration. It could be softened with warm milk and sugar for children or crumbled into puddings and meatloaf fillers to bulk out recipes. Some families even soaked it in broth or fruit juice for dessert-like treats. When biscuits were gone and crackers were out of reach, Zwieback toast filled the gap. It had a mild flavor and could go sweet or savory, depending on what you added. People loved it for its reliability. It would not mold, spoil, or turn on you. You could keep it in a tin for weeks and still count on it to do its job. For babies and the elderly, it was soaked soft. For everyone else, it was just one more way to stretch bread far past its shelf life. Bacon grease jar cooking was not just a habit, it was a household rule. You never threw out bacon fat, not once. It was poured hot into a tin can or a glass jar, usually kept by the stove, and reused for just about everything. Fried potatoes, sautéed greens, biscuits brushed on top for that golden shine. Some families even swore by it for making popcorn. It added flavor where there was none and stretched what little fat you had across the whole week. Bacon grease turned bland cabbage into something rich and smoky. It revived day-old cornbread and crisped up onions like nothing else. The jar was never labeled, and no one needed it to be. You just knew what it was by the smell. Today, we are told to throw away fat and use olive oil instead. But back then, this was gold. It was seasoning, substance, and thrift all in one. And even though it is missing from most cookbooks now, that old bacon jar still lives on in a few quiet kitchens that remember its worth. Wrapping sandwiches in wax paper rolls was the go-to method for packing love into a lunch. Plastic bags were not always around, and foil was saved for the big stuff. So housewives would roll sandwiches tightly in wax paper, sometimes tying them off with twine or ribbon. It kept the bread fresh and the filling in place, and when unwrapped, the sandwich still looked crisp, not smushed. It was part presentation, part preservation. A school lunch wrapped this way looked neat and thoughtful. For working husbands and school children alike, it was a small sign that someone had taken time to make lunch right. Wax paper had a soft crackle that was almost comforting to unfold. It did not sweat, it did not stick, and it could be tucked right back into a lunch pail when done. In an age before single-use plastics ruled the kitchen, this was the gold standard. It was clean, smart, and just a little sentimental. Double-duty roast chicken was the ultimate lesson in using one bird for nearly a week of dinners without anyone feeling shortchanged. On Sunday, Grandma roasted the chicken with onions, carrots, and herbs, filling the house with aromas that drew every family member to the table. After carving generous slices for the main meal, she carefully saved every bone and leftover scrap. The next day, the carcass simmered into a rich golden stock that became soup or gravy, while the remaining meat found its way into sandwiches, pot pies, or creamy casseroles. Nothing was wasted, not even the drippings which flavored biscuits and vegetables for days. Each time the family sat down to another variation, they marveled that the same chicken kept giving comfort, night after night. This practice was part art, part discipline, and entirely about love and foresight, turning a single purchase into a string of nourishing memories. Using leftover ham bones in soup was one of the thrifty lessons that showed how waste could be turned into days of meals. Teachers explained how bones, with bits of meat still clinging, flavored beans, split peas, or lentils into hearty dishes. Students watched as a pot transformed simple, inexpensive ingredients into something rich and filling. It was a lesson in thrift, nutrition, and patience all at once. The aroma of simmering beans flavored by ham bone carried a comfort that stayed with students long after class. Families often knew the trick already, but seeing it taught in school reinforced its value. For households with little to spare, nothing was wasted, not even bones. Students realized that flavor did not have to come from expensive cuts. but from knowing how to use what you had. Soups like these warmed homes, filled stomachs, and reminded everyone of resourcefulness. Home economics kept alive the art of stretching food until nothing remained. It was more than cooking, it was survival turned flavorful. Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. How to make white sauce from scratch was one of the first lessons in home economics class because it was the base of so many other dishes. A little butter, a little flour, and a careful hand with the milk could turn into something that tied together casseroles, vegetables, or even gravies. Grandmothers may have learned it at home, but in the classroom, it was treated as a skill every student needed. If you could make a white sauce, you could dress up leftovers or stretch out a small amount of meat with creamed vegetables. Teachers drilled in the importance of stirring constantly, never letting lumps form, and seasoning at the end for flavor. It seemed simple, yet it was the foundation for dozens of meals that otherwise would have been plain. Students left class knowing they could create something smooth and creamy out of the bare minimum. It was clever, thrifty, and practical, which was the entire point of home economics. Making vinegar from apple scraps was an old and clever trick that turned what others considered waste into something valuable and lasting. After peeling or coring apples for pies, preserves, or snacks, grandfathers and grandmothers would gather the scraps into jars or crocks, cover them with water and sugar, and leave them to ferment naturally. Over time, wild yeasts transformed the mixture into tangy homemade cider vinegar. It required no special tools, only patience and an understanding that nature would do most of the work. Families stored these crocks in pantries or cellars where they aged until ready to use. The vinegar was versatile. It added flavor to sauces and marinades, tenderized tougher cuts of meat, preserved vegetables through pickling, and even served as a cleaner around the house. In lean years, making vinegar at home saved valuable money since store-bought versions were unnecessary. It also offered a sense of independence, knowing every part of the apple had a purpose and nothing went to waste. This practice was more than just thrifty, it was a proud example of resourcefulness and creativity. Homemade vinegar stood as proof that clever living turned scraps into sustenance and tradition. Turning stale bread into homemade croutons was one of the simplest yet smartest tricks in a 1950s kitchen. Bread never lasted forever, especially before preservatives became the norm. But a housewife would never let a loaf go to waste. Instead, she would cut it into cubes, drizzle with a bit of oil or bacon grease, toss in whatever seasoning she had on hand, and bake until crisp. These croutons were then stored in jars and added to soups, casseroles, or salads for days to come. They brought crunch, comfort, and a sense of creativity to any meal. You did not need to buy anything new, just make the old new again. Kids loved them, husbands noticed them, and guests thought they were fancy. All from a slice that might have otherwise gone to the birds. It was a perfect example of homemaking in the 1950s, clever, quiet, and deeply practical. Housewives learned to turn a potential waste into a winning side dish, and the smell of toasting bread with a hint of garlic or butter, that alone could bring the whole family to the kitchen. Today, we buy croutons in boxes. Back then, we made them from scraps, with pride. The secret of fluffy biscuits was another cherished teaching moment. Students learned that the way you cut the shortening into the flour decided if the biscuits would rise high and soft or fall flat and heavy. Rolling too much made them tough, while leaving the dough just shaggy gave them a tall lift in the oven. Teachers would gather the class around and show how to press the pastry cutter or two knives together until the flour looked like small pebbles. Then came the gentle fold of milk and kneading only once or twice before cutting. It was a matter of touch, not just following a recipe. The pride of seeing biscuits rise golden in the school ovens left a memory many never forgot. These were not store-bought rolls. They were warm, homemade proof of skill. Biscuits at dinner were not just bread. They were a sign that you had mastered something worth sharing. Saltine cracker pie crusts might sound like desperation, but they were actually ingenious. When graham crackers were too expensive or simply unavailable, housewives crushed saltines, mixed them with butter and sugar, and pressed them into pie pans. Once baked, they made a surprisingly crisp and sturdy base that carried fillings as well as any graham crust. This trick stretched dessert options and allowed pies to appear regularly on tables that might not have afforded them otherwise. The slight saltiness of the crackers paired well with sweet custards or fruit fillings, making the pies memorable in their own right. Children never knew the difference, and guests often assumed it was just another creative recipe passed down through family lines. It was yet another example of the ingenuity that marked 70s kitchens, where substitutions did not feel like sacrifice. Housewives knew that as long as it looked polished and tasted good, no one asked questions. Mayo in chocolate cake might sound strange to modern ears, but for 1960s moms it was a lifesaver when eggs and oil were too expensive or simply ran out. Mayonnaise was made from eggs and oil, so adding a spoonful to cake batter replaced both while making the cake incredibly moist. This trick became a secret weapon for birthdays, church gatherings, or any day when dessert was needed but the pantry was bare. The result was a cake so tender and rich that no one could tell it was built on substitution. Moms embraced it because it was practical, affordable, and foolproof, proving once again that resourcefulness could create results equal to or better than traditional methods. The mayonnaise cake became a beloved memory for many children of that era who associated it with celebrations even if money was tight. It was clever cooking at its best, born of necessity but remembered for indulgence. Stretching ground beef with oats or crackers was a trick every student remembered because it turned 1 pound of meat into a dish that could feed a whole family. In the home economics classroom, meatloaf was often the example, but the lesson applied to hamburgers or casseroles as well. Students were taught to mix rolled oats or crushed saltine crackers with the beef, letting the starch soak up juices and hold everything together. It was not just thrift, it was clever cooking that made food taste hearty even when meat was expensive. For many families during the 1960s or 1970s, this trick meant the difference between 2 servings and 6. Seasonings like onions or ketchup added flavor, but the bulk came from those fillers. Teachers stressed that nothing was wasted and that cooking was as much about economy as taste. Graduates of those classes never forgot how a little stretch could go a long way when it came to feeding hungry mouths. Making gravy from pan drippings was one of those clever tricks that turned scraps into something that felt like a feast. Grandfathers did not need store-bought mixes or powders. They simply saved the grease left in the skillet after frying meat, stirred in a bit of flour, and added water or milk until it thickened. The drippings carried all the flavor from the meat, giving the gravy depth without costing a cent. This was poured over biscuits, potatoes, or vegetables to stretch small meals further. Even a plain dinner suddenly tasted hearty and comforting with gravy on top. It was an economical habit that also became a flavor tradition in many homes. The method required nothing more than patience and a steady hand at the stove. Families who grew up on meals like this remember it as the taste of home, rich and simple at the same time. Today, most people buy mixes, but the old method proved resourcefulness always tasted better. Salt harvesting from natural licks and how it changed food forever is one of those hidden stories that shaped survival more than we realize. In a world without grocery stores or factories, finding salt meant everything. Native American communities knew where the land bled salt, places where groundwater left behind crystals, or wild animals led the way to salt licks hidden deep in forests and valleys. They would collect the precious mineral by hand, scraping or boiling it out of muddy springs, then carefully drying and storing it for trade, cooking, and medicine. Salt preserved meats, flavored stews, and replenished bodies worn down by long journeys or brutal seasons. It was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. But salt was not the only way native chefs elevated their meals. When it came to pure, haunting flavor, they had another secret weapon: the living aroma of the woods themselves turned into smoke and magic. Boiled hamburger patties were never glamorous, but they got the job done. In the name of health, or sometimes just thrift, home cooks were advised to boil their ground beef patties instead of frying them. The idea was to reduce fat and keep the meat moist without needing extra oil. The patties were formed, dropped into gently simmering water or broth, and cooked until firm. The result was softer than a grilled burger, but still surprisingly flavorful, especially if the liquid was seasoned. Some added onions or garlic to the pot to give the meat extra depth, while others used leftover broth for soups later. This method showed up in diet cookbooks, military manuals, and penny-saving guides alike. It was also recommended for feeding young children or the elderly who needed soft, easy-to-chew proteins. It might not have had that backyard burger smell, but it filled a plate just the same. And sometimes, especially during hard times, that was all that mattered. Jell-O as a leftover preserver may sound like a party trick today, but in the 1950s, it was a serious solution to a serious problem: food waste. Housewives would take leftover vegetables, bits of meat, or even chopped eggs and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. The result was a molded salad that kept longer and looked surprisingly elegant on the table. It was not about being fancy. It was about stretching a meal into the next day and keeping it safe without refrigeration on every corner. Jell-O sealed the food in and slowed spoilage, giving families another day or two to use it. You would chill the mold in a shallow dish, pop it out when company came over, and suddenly leftovers became a centerpiece. Some folks raised an eyebrow at ham and lime gelatin, but others swore by it. And when choices were few, you used what worked. Housewives did not flinch. They got creative. It was frugal, clever, and oddly festive. That wobble meant something back then. It meant no waste, full bellies, and a little color on a dinner table that needed cheering up. Quick pickling cucumbers was a fun project that students loved because the results came so quickly. Teachers demonstrated how vinegar, sugar, and salt could transform slices into crisp pickles in just hours. Garlic, dill, or peppercorns could be added for variety, making the jars look as appealing as they tasted. This was not the long process of canning, but a quick trick that taught the basics of preservation. Students enjoyed tasting their pickles the next day, marveling at the flavor that seemed too strong for such a short time. Families at home welcomed jars of refrigerator pickles that added crunch to sandwiches or dinners. The lesson showed that not all preservation needed special equipment, just resourcefulness and a willingness to experiment. It captured the spirit of home economics perfectly: simple ingredients, clever methods, and satisfying results. Pickling cucumbers this way turned an ordinary vegetable into something bright and refreshing without much effort at all. Cooking corn directly in husks was an old method that brought out flavors in ways modern kitchens often overlook. Grandfathers would toss whole ears of corn, husks and all, into hot coals or onto the edges of wood stoves. The husks protected the kernels while trapping steam inside, leaving the corn tender and naturally sweet. The slight charring added a smoky taste that felt indulgent even when it was just a simple farm staple. Butter was not always available, but steaming corn in husks gave it a richness all its own. Families often gathered outside around fires to share ears peeled back fresh from the embers. It was easy, filling, and satisfying, especially after a long day of work. The method required no pots, pans, or fancy seasonings, just patience and an open flame. Even today, few things compare to the rustic taste of corn roasted this way. It was proof that the simplest tricks made some of the most unforgettable meals. Tomato juice as a soup-based starter was one of those ideas that seemed too simple to matter, until you tried it. When canned broth was hard to find or too expensive, people needed something flavorful, shelf-stable, and easy to stretch. Tomato juice fit the bill perfectly. It added color, acidity, and a rich, savory base that made even the most basic vegetable soup taste like it had simmered for hours. It was especially popular in the 1940s and 1950s, when canned juices were lining grocery shelves and meat was either rationed or just plain pricey. Recipes would call for a cup of tomato juice, some diced potatoes or cabbage, and maybe a scoop of rice or beans. Suddenly, dinner was done. You could serve it with crackers or cornbread, or even pour it over noodles if you had them. It was quick, clean, and cost next to nothing. Some families even poured leftover tomato juice from canned tomatoes right into the pot. Waste not, want not. These soups were humble, but they were hearty, and sometimes that is all you needed, especially when times were tight. Ice cube trays were more than just for ice. In the 1950s, housewives used them to portion and preserve homemade broth, leftover gravy, or any bit of soup that seemed too good to toss. Once frozen, those little cubes of flavor could be popped into a pot weeks later to bring life back into a stew, casserole, or skillet of vegetables. Chicken stock from a roast dinner? Poured it in. Leftover beef drippings mixed with water? Froze it too. This trick was both practical and brilliant. It kept meals from tasting bland and helped stretch flavor when seasonings were in short supply. Plus, it was a way to avoid spoilage without relying on bulky storage or wasting fridge space. Ice cube trays were cheap, easy to clean, and always handy. You knew you were doing things right when your freezer had a few trays filled with amber or golden broth. It made midweek cooking faster and tastier. Modern kitchens have gadgets for everything, but back then, a simple metal tray turned scraps into meal starters. Clever and quiet, this trick turned tiny cubes into powerful bursts of comfort and helped every meal feel just a bit more homemade. Most of those tricks were never written down. They passed from one pair of hands to the next at a kitchen counter, always by feel, never by recipe. 100 of them just played out in front of you, and every single one still works on a modern stove with whatever you already have in the cabinet. If you picked up even one trick worth trying tonight, share this video with someone who grew up in that kind of kitchen. Hit subscribe so you never miss another one.